and then go into then the capitalist machine and capitalist representation and the relationship of Adam Smith and Freud that they point out later in this chapter for next week. But this week to continue to talk about Oedipus at the limit and some of the findings they have in anthropology, and certainly the role of Nietzsche, in this section, especially on, maybe I could call it the untamed, the wild instead of the savage or the primitive. Maybe the untamed would be better, the undomesticated, if you will, before becoming barbarians. I don't know. Trying to think of better ways than to use the notion of savages. Which is which is a losing term in baseball, by the way, because the New York Yankees are called the Savages, a bunch of savages. They're hitters, but they're not hitting. So it's a bad phrase to use by their manager. Anyway. So anyway, maybe I can begin. I mean, I thought last week was very, very fruitful. We only really went over about, a couple of sections, but I thought it was dense and very open-ended. I want to think, if you will, or restate this beginning here of the axes of filiation and alliance that they begin with in terms of the primitive, or again, the untamed representation. And the desiring here is always germinative flow. That's really what it's about before the coding of Oedipus, etc. So we have three instances, if you will, of representation. One, of course, is desire, right? The general intensity which conditions all representation, desire itself, and then alliance, which leads to marriage. And of course, the great book on this, at least in my mind, from structural anthropology, is Levi-Strauss's book on the kinship relations. Yeah. It's a great book on the multi-volumes on that. And Levi-Strauss, as you know, tries his hand at a Rohamian analysis of culture in The Origin of Table Manners, From Honey to Ashes, and his multiple stories of cultural things. I think he tries to become the Norman Elias, the German anthropologist in France in some ways, that he branches out that way. I'm being very reductive here, but I think it's interesting to see these filiations at work, if you will. Yeah. So in a lot of ways. So, and then, after we get through the desired alliance, we find Oedipus at the limit. Right, we find Oedipus at the limit here of the untamed. This is where Oedipus is made and formed. And so I thought what I would do is we would begin with that limit first, as a limit, which starts on page 171, and then move, if you will, and please forgive my moving around this way, but I think I have some logic to it. And then we would move back to the Nietzschean genealogy, which is absolutely crucial for a reading of this section, and I think for the book too. Again, I recommend especially the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals by Friedrich Nietzsche. Very, very crucial for understanding their attempt to look at, why Oedipus is a limit, why we have to think beyond it, etc. Yeah. So anyway, I want to begin here again, page 171, and please feel free to intervene. Let's turn to page 171, the first paragraph. I'm going to give you the section again. This is in psychoanalysis and ethnology, which I think is one of the richer tech parts of the text here. The whole text. In terms of their engagement with anthropology. And, I want to say this to Reggie Debray in a book on teachers, writers, and celebrities, or intellectual power in France. when he analyzed the role of the intellectual in France, really basically said the philosophers have to take a step back and learn from the anthropologists, that a lot of the findings of the anthropologists were much greater than a lot of the recent philosophical work. So it's very interesting, that kind of comment to me. And obviously Deleuze and Guattari are engaged here. But let's go to 171. It's about, I guess, 6 paragraphs in. Let me see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, 6 paragraphs in from the beginning of section 4 of part 3. Let us return to the well-known and inexhaustible debate between the culturalists, and this, of course, is the culturalist psychoanalysts, and orthodox psychoanalysis. Is Oedipus universal? Okay, this is a thing that's right. Is Oedipus the great paternal Catholic symbol, the meeting place of all the churches? The debate began with the anthropologist Malinowski and Jones, Ernest Jones. It continued between Gardner and Fromm on one side and Roheim on the other. It is still pursued between certain ethnologists and certain disciples of Lacan, those who offer not only an Oedipalizing interpretation of Lacan's doctrine, but also an ethnographic extension to this interpretation. On the one side of the universal, there are 2 poles. One, outdated, it would seem, that makes of Oedipus an original affective constellation, and that constitutes an extreme position, arguing that Oedipus was a real event whose effects were transmitted through phylogenetic hereditary. The other pole, which makes Oedipus into a structure, a pole whose extreme position argues the possibility of discovering the structure in fantasy in relation to biological prematuration and neoteny. 2 very different conceptions of the limit. One is an original matrix, or paradigm, if you would like. The other is a structural function. But in both these senses of the universal, we are invited to interpret, since the latent presence of Oedipus appears only through its patent absence, understood as an effect of psychic repression, or better still, since the structural constant is discovered only through its imaginary variations, attesting to the need for symbolic foreclosure, the father as an empty position, Oedipus is universal, recommences the old metaphysical operation that consists in interpreting negation as deprivation, as a lack, the symbolic lack of the dead father or the great signifier. Interpretation is our modern way of believing and of being pious. Interpretation replaces religion. I mean, in some ways, they may be making a kind of stab at Schleiermacher and the hermeneutical tradition, and in some ways, it's a possibility. But already, let me go on. Geza Roheim proposed organizing primitives, or the untamed again, into a series of variables, converging towards the structural neotenic constant. It was he who said, in all seriousness, that the Oedipus complex was not to be found if it wasn't looked for, and that one wasn't looking if one hadn't had oneself analyzed. And that is why your daughter is mute, which is to say, the tribes, the daughters of the ethnologists, do not say Oedipus, although it is Oedipus who makes them speak. Roheim added that it was ridiculous to think that the Freudian theory of censorship depended on the repressive regime in the empire of Franz Joseph. He did not seem to see that Franz Joseph was not a pertinent historical break, but that perhaps the oral, the written, or even the capitalist civilizations were such breaks with which the nature of social repression and the meaning and scope of psychic repression would vary. Okay, so this is very, and Jane, I see you're here, and anybody else that came in. I'm reading from part 4 of, section 4 of part 3 on psychoanalysis and ethnology, and it's about 6 paragraphs in that begins, let us return to the well-known and inexhaustible debate between the culturalists and orthodox psychoanalysis. Right. Anyway, I'm on the next full paragraph. The story of psychic repression is quite complicated. Things would be simpler if the libido or affect were repressed in the most general sense of the word, suppressed, inhibited, or transformed at the same time as the supposed Oedipal representation. But such is not the case. Most ethnologists have clearly noted the sexual nature of affects in the public symbols of primitive societies, and this nature remains integrally lived by members of these societies, even though they have not been psychoanalyzed, and in spite of the displacement of the representation. Leach says apropos of the sex-hair relationship, displaced phallic symbolism is very common, but the phallic origin of the symbolism is not repressed. Must it be said that primitives repress the representation and keep the affect intact? And would the contrary be true in our case, in the patriarchal organization where the representation would remain clear, but with the affect suppressed, inhibited, or transformed? No. In fact, psychoanalysis tells us that we too repress the representation. And everything tells us that we too often keep the full sexuality of the affect. We know perfectly well what it's about without having been psychoanalyzed. But what enables one to speak of an Oedipal representation that would be the object of a representation? What enables us to be able to speak this way? Is it because incest is prohibited? We always fall back on the pale rationale, this pale rationale. And they're going to always go back to this notion of incest and prohibition and the founding of the law. Incest is desired because it is prohibited. The prohibition of incest would therefore imply an Oedipal representation. It would be born of the repression of this representation and the latter's return. Now, the opposite is clearly the case. Not only does the Oedipal representation presuppose the prohibition of incest, but it is not even possible to say that the representation is born of the prohibition or results from it. Adopting Malinowski's arguments, Reich added a profound remark. Desire is all the more Oedipal as the prohibition are aimed not simply at incest, but at all other types of sexual relations, blocking the other paths. In a word, the repression of incest is not born of a repressed Oedipal representation any more than it provokes this repression. But, and this is something altogether different, the general social repression, psychic repression system, which we went over somewhat last week and the week before, gives rise to an Oedipal image as a disfiguration of the repressed. The fact that this image in turn finally suffers a repression, that it comes to take the place of the repressed or of the thing that is effectively desired, insofar as sexual repression is directed at something other than incest. Such is the long history of our society. But the repressed is not, first of all, the Oedipal representation. What is repressed, and this is going to be their main point, is desiring production. It is part of this production that does not enter, the part of this production that does not enter into social production or reproduction. It is what would introduce disorder and revolution into the socius, the non-coded flows of desire. The part that passes, on the contrary, from desiring production to social production, forms a direct sexual investment of this social production without any repression of the sexual nature of the symbolism and the corresponding affects, and above all, without any reference to an Oedipal representation that could be held to be originally repressed or structurally foreclosed. The animal in us is not merely the object of a preconscious investment determined by interest, but the object of a libidinal investment of desire that only secondarily derives an image of the father from desiring production. The same holds true of the libidinal investment of food. Whenever a fear of going hungry is evident, or a pleasure at not being hungry, and this investment refers only secondarily to an image of the mother. We have already seen how the prohibition of incest referred not to Oedipus, but to the non-coded, again, I emphasize, the non-coded flows that constitute desire, and to their representative, the intense pre-personal flow. As for Oedipus, it is another way of coding the uncodable, of codifying what eludes the codes, or of displacing desire and its object, a way of entrapping them. So I'd like to, start with this tonight in some ways, this kind of history that they're doing, both of psychic repression and also of social repression and this relationship that they're seeing here, and how they see the whole Oedipal journey, if you will, from the writing, the fiction, the play itself, the legend that's formed, and then of course the complex, and then the domination in psychoanalysis is always based in some levels on the prohibition of incest, right? And that this is really a secondary phenomena in terms of, for the cultural psychoanalysts or for the ethnologists that have studied this in, the quote untamed societies, or in terms of their work on these cultures. So I'd like to begin there. And any thoughts about it? Because this is interesting in a way, because again, they're trying to tear apart or take the veil away from a kind of institutionalized practice, a common traditional practice, and what's going on, and to kind of get outside once again of this Oedipal triangle of the daddy, mommy, me, that Artaud so much fights against. And I think he's very present in this chapter. Is Antonin Artaud is very, very present in this chapter in terms of the theater of cruelty too, because we're going to, I'm going to make maybe a move to the genealogy of morals as well here. The cruelty of mnemotechnic and our basically our ways of being inscribed, etc. So first of all, I'll ask you, I mean, I know I'm starting off with a very dense passage again, and, but I think this follows up on, what we've sort of been talking about from the last couple of weeks. And, is this a universal, at this point? Do we have to continue with this as a universal? Yeah, in many ways. Or is Antigone a universal on the other side? Yeah, in terms of the relations, or is there something else going on too? So we can look at maybe this too, this relationship to both Greek tragedy, and I'm very prejudiced in this regards, being Greek and having been to Epidaurus and seeing the Greek, tragic theater performed, etc. But on the other hand, is this theatrical representation what they're trying to get to again? Or, or is this sort of out and out critique again? Yeah. So, several things out there. So anybody? Yeah. I mean, I don't know how much you know of the tradition of the psychoanalysis and anthropology, but it has a very rich tradition of which Norman O'Brown in Life Against Death draws heavily on, and then later in his book called Love's Body, very, very active in Norman O'Brown's thinking, who was a classicist by training. And of course, Marcuse in Eros and Civilization uses a lot of Roheim's findings. And for those of you that read Derrida, Gesture and Speech of André Leroi-Gourhan is a very fundamental text behind this. And in a way, they're going to go further, and I'm very sorry I don't have my copy of Gems left, but I'll probably send out, if I ever get to Montreal, I'll do a special session on Gemselvian linguistics versus Saussurean, because they see Saussurean linguistics as a result of capitalist encoding. And we'll talk about this later. So anyway, this is a very subversive book the more I read it. There's always something being unearthed and, kind of movement and underturned. Whether or not it's, in our kind of logic is another story. But there's a lot of, and remember, this first section is about the connective synthesis. It's not about the disjunctive yet. The disjunctive is more active in the next section on the barbarian. And, I think Carl's going to like the next section because there's a lot on money and political economy. Yeah. So anyway, anybody want to speak?
Just clarification. I mean, I found this section rich, but it's not an area I'm familiar with, so maybe that's
right. Okay.
But also difficult in many ways. And I'm trying to kind of piece it together. I mean, it seems like they make a lot between the idea of the intensive germinal flows,
right,
and the filial relationship, which is sort of this undifferentiated body where everyone is kind of everybody else. There's not like a differentiation of persons. And they actually at one point say,
well, it hasn't been coded yet into alliance formations.
right.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
that
It hasn't been coded into an alliance. So keep that in mind too. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead.
yeah,
I'm
yeah,
sorry. Yeah.
no, and then there's the alliance, and that the system of alliance, or the kinship systems, which are coded, and then there's these chains and these exchanges that take place in the
Right.
formation of debts, and these
Right.
kind of a Levi-Strauss type, kinship structure. Um, but it seems like what they're saying, it's on page 162 that they
Okay.
talk about.
Tell me the section because I have a different edition and maybe other people do too.
It's yeah, so it's page 162. Let's see, the
There's in
second
the section. It's in
problem of
what
Oedipus.
section? Section 3, right? The problem of
Yeah,
Oedipus. So you
yeah,
can see that they problematize. There is a logic here. First of all, the problem that Oedipus proposes, and now the relationship of Oedipus to the findings of the ethnologist. So the logic in terms of at least, linearly speaking, right, in terms of successive logic, they are proceeding in such a way where there is a then and, right, operative. I want to just say that, yeah. But yeah, go ahead. Tell me what.
yeah. Just no. So I again, I'm just trying to understand all this.
Yeah.
So they say the intensive germinal flow is the representative of desire. It is against this flow that the repression is directed. So it seemed like they're talking about, again, it's this filial system, or it's not even a system, it's just kind of an energy. It's this kind of undifferentiated, uncoded flow. And there's these other passages where they talk about, I am the mother, that everyone is there. There aren't differentiated persons, there aren't prohibitions. And that then the way I sort of read them is that the system of alliance is introducing these prohibitions, but it seems that the reason that introduction takes place is that if you didn't have it, you would, in some sense, just have absolute disorder. So I guess like the mechanism that they're proposing here, I'd just like to hear other people what they
Sure.
were
Sure.
able to
Yeah.
pull out, because I
Just let me just say this. I mean, what you're describing again, and I don't want to go into this language too much, but desiring production is at the base, right? Always,
right.
right? Desiring
You muted.
about that. Yeah, I was just saying, desiring production is at the base, and we always have to keep that in mind, right?
Right.
And then when we talk about germinal and germination, right, this is happening within desiring production all the time before there is any kind of coding into the law of the prohibition of incest, right, or any kind of alliance, et cetera. There's filiation going on, but that's very originary in that sense. So, I mean, there are three levels here. If you can keep this in mind in terms of axes, you can think three axes. And again, I really wish I had a blackboard because I probably diagrammed this pretty well. The first axis, once again, and if you think of desiring production behind this, right? This is the movement that's always, going on, right? Desiring production and the body without organs, which is, basically, in some ways the constant throughout this, right? As well as desiring production as a term that is merging, libido with the notion of Marx and production, right? It's a kind of attempt to bring together Marx and Freud into one basic concept, right, that they can work throughout this, right, in a sense. Okay, so try to keep that in mind. So you have three axes on which this desiring production is working. One, of course, is on the level of the filiation and germinal flux and germinative flow, right? And again, the flows are always what's happening, especially in that. And these are, in some ways, many uncoded flows, right? He's very, Guattari is particularly against any kind of flow. So really, in some ways, to use a later Deleuzian language and something that some people like a lot, to use the nomad in a way. The nomad thought, that which was without territorial representation. Maybe the fully deterritorialized body of the earth in a way. And the socius is the body of the earth as well as us. The socius in some ways is very much close to, and I mean, this would be a very good exploration, I think, in a conceptual essay about how the socius is very close to Spinoza's notion of nature naturing. The socius is always already there, right? Yeah, it's the body of the earth. It's nature in some ways itself, and nature works with both industry and history. There are many, many, many levels to all of this. Okay, so that filiation is always a flow, right? Always a flow.
Right. Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. Yes.
Right? Okay, so and it's an uncoded flow, right?
Right.
So the alliance is when the beginning. So for Deleuze and Guattari, alliance, marriage, is basically the repression of homosexuality. This is what they think in some ways, right? They actually say this, that this is part of what's on the table for them, that the alliance and the marriage and this beginning of the law in some ways is an attempt towards not desiring production, but desiring reproduction and a codification of this. Right? This is what they see. So we go from filiation to alliance, which then begins to build the tribe and formations. We're no longer in just the untamed. We begin to be put into tribal formations. It's the beginning of the stories of real kinship, right, and hierarchy, and totemic structures, right, and then ultimately the taboo. And this is
why does that repression take place? Like why? Oh. It's almost like that's what they are identifying as the original repression of homosexuality. Right.
Well, that's an alliance. So getting to the alliance, yes, yeah. I don't know, yeah. I mean, I don't think they explain that, but yeah. I mean, yeah. But this is what they're really trying to do, is get beyond both patrilinear and matrilinear, right? In many ways, the nature of the marriage, right? How that happens, how lineage actually begins, and how extended filiation, they really are talking about how filiation extends itself, right? And in this extended filiation, something dangerous is happening. And in a way, there's something that happens or clicks that wants a lateral alliance, right? It becomes a lateral alliance, and that becomes the moment of the alliance itself. And they go through many cultures on this. This is why this is complicated. And I know this is a lot of work, right? To go back to the Dogen thing. They mentioned the Tivu tribe and some obscure anthropology. I don't know how many of you have read Malinowski, but again, they're reading this research and trying to get beyond that of this quote Greco-Roman world, if you will. So this is another reason we can read this as a decolonizing text, right? In some ways, it's a kind of early attempt at another kind of a way of looking at Athena, looking at Oedipus, etc., going forward. But anyway, the alliance is coming out of the reading, if you will, of Totem and Taboo, right? Where Freud relates the story of the primal, killing of the father by the brotherhood, because the father has all the women and all the goods, right? What they discover in this is that in the beginning, yes, they could just have their sisters or their brother, whatever it was, but then they found out without a law, right? The father is more powerful dead, and this began the law of the law itself, was incest prohibition, according to Freud, right? And this is what, again, Oedipus is built upon, right? I mean, what is Oedipus's thing? Bruno, yeah.
No, Michael, maybe I misread, but at one point I thought that I thought that the alliance in marriage rather also establishes a kind of institutionalized, if hidden or half hidden homosexual culture, right? I mean,
That's why
so
I
there
said it
was,
was repressed. Yeah, and I'm not saying that
okay,
this was the art. That's why I'm saying it was a repressed. Yes,
okay.
it hides it. Yes, yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So anyway, so we go from there. You know, we begin to live through this thing. Does Yocasta know what's going on the whole time? Right? Is she in possession of the law at that point through Tiresias? How do we really read this play? How do we really read it and then interpret it? Pasolini, for example, who Bruno and I have discussions about often, in terms of liking, disliking, better films, etc. But anyway, all to say, his film Oedipus Rex, he presents Yocasta in her eyes as knowing all along who she's sleeping with, right? That she was aware that matrilinear culture somehow was superior in knowing the myth itself. It was not so much it was unknown to her, right? Etc. So, I mean, that's one interpretation, of course, right? But think about this, how much of the Western civilization is based on these structures of incest, right? Think what's going on. Many of our issues, right? In terms of the structure of incest. Right? And alliance formations in this regard, right? Think about the depth. Why, I mean, for me, it's always a question, why does Antigone live so long, right, in terms of our minds, right? Why does it become such a classic text? Why does Holderlin maybe go mad translating this in terms of its meditation on this kind of merger of psychoanalysis and ethnology? This beautiful section, the Ode to Eros. I recommend reading that once a year. That and Moby Dick. Anyway, this is something that you could really gain from. But anyway, again, the question is, how do you get from filiation, right, again, to this alliance? But what are they really trying to do here? They're trying to get us to the point of where we see Oedipus as a limit. Right? Is it a universal, right? And is it a universal then only to capital? Is it an invention ultimately of capital, right? In a sense. So this is about, it's complication here in many ways, how complicated it becomes in that regard. So I don't know. Yeah, sure. I'd love to hear from other people. I'm sorry to, take up, the question is, what is this limit? Because what they're really trying to do is push everything, and not only in the dialectical sense. This is not a Hegelian or a Marxian dialectic at work here. These are different levels of connecting, disjunctions, and conjunctive syntheses happening. This is much different than the normal way of the dialectic. In fact, in some ways, this book is an attempt, I think, about Deleuze, who wants to get away from the dialectic, and Guattari, who think that dialectizing things is a way of recoding, in some ways, and a kind of restructuration. This is why they want to push to the limit of where they get to the schizoid. And remember, last week I said the relative limit, right, is capitalism. But the absolute limit is schizophrenia in this paradigm, right? In this what they're dealing with. So to get all the way to the limit of where the Oedipal story is only a relative story here. And for this reason, they're trying to go beyond or look at this relationship between psychoanalysis and ultimately what we'll get to schizoanalysis as a very different kind of tension, as into the new order. So anyway, yeah, I'd love to hear from other people. I mean, again, we're not really searching for origins here. We're just seeing how they're operating. They're operating on axes. The axis, again, affiliation, right? Desiring production as a presupposition, an axis of affiliation, alliance, and then Oedipus as a limit. This is the limit that is thought relatively, right? In this section on quote, Oedipus and ethnology, Oedipus as a problem together.
Michael, what's interesting about the limit, and that's the page 161 before the one from which Carl read. And maybe we touched on this last time, I don't remember, but the limit is really a kind of tension, the way they look at the limit, almost, it's neither this side nor a beyond. They say, I mean, it is always crossed already or not yet crossed every time. So, I mean, it is really this tension. I think it's very interesting. Maybe we can, read that for a moment. I mean, think about that. Page 161, okay?
And
Which line?
tell me the beginning of the.
Yeah, the
sorry,
beginning is.
I have the old edition, yeah.
Right, the beginning of the paragraph is on here on this edition, page 160, with Griol, if I pronounce correctly. Griol's article is.
Griol, yeah.
Right, and then they go into the question that incest does not exist. And toward the end of that paragraph, 10 lines from the end, there is this comment on the question of the law, the limit, and then what I just said, that the limit has a moment of tension all the time. Okay, you see that? Yeah.
I do. I know where it is. Yeah. And this is a reading of the Devro School of Anthropology as well. This is, again, another form of anthropology that's going on during the time of the writing of this book, right? They're taking a lot of their work of, from Griol and Michel Cartier, right? Who was a good friend in Adler. I think I mentioned them last week. These were all colleagues and friends of Felix Guattari, right? That is operative here. But yeah, tell me what you want to say. The transgression and the prohibition is part of the tension always, in a way.
I just wanted to call attention to that. I mean, especially when they say it is necessary to recall once more that the law proves nothing about an original reality of desire, because it is essentially disfigured desire. Right. It essentially disfigures the desire. And then this may go also into the question of one of the two ways of understanding the limit as structure rather than the universal. And they say later on, in page maybe 172, how structures are real. I mean, they are not mental, constructs. But in any case, right. And then the transgression. And then after the next sentence, where they say, in short, the limit is neither a this side of, nor a beyond. It is the boundary line between the two, right? Always crossed already or not yet crossed. So a kind of threshold, really, that in 1,000 Plateau, they also say, like, the threshold is the space around the limit, beyond the limit. So it is in this tension that maybe they're working with, right? I mean, the moment of, it's not an impasse, but also, since you mentioned the dialectic, that's interesting too. There is this kind of, tension that brings about also what you were saying, then later, the section we were reading for today, they go into the question of precisely capitalism and schizophrenia, and the question of the limit and how they are precisely not identical but different, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Could I tell me if this makes sense? That this might be.
This is not supposed to make sense. That's part of the issue that's going on. I mean, I'm trying my best to. I mean, in a way, it's a very different, attempt. I mean, it's please.
Yeah. So that's very interesting what Bruno was just saying. I mean, I got an image in my mind of almost as limit is almost mathematical in some ways. That it's the kind of the point of absolute convergence that is really at zero. But I guess the way I read this is that when they're saying incest does not exist, it seems like you're either on the side of the filial, the sort of the intense germinal flow, or you're on the side of the alliance. It's almost like there's this disjuncture, there's this break. And that break is what ensures that incest, like in that system, for that organization, incest does not exist because it's been sort of repressed and then displaced. And they have this other idea about the repressing, how does it go? The repressing representative,
well, that's another thing that they're raising questions of representation
yeah.
here and the
But
symbolic
I got
order.
it.
I mean,
Again, just to read this other side. This is like I was trying to just understand what are they getting at. And this is on page 155 where they talk about the intensive energetic order, and then they said it's an energy of filiation, and it does not yet comprise any distinction of persons or even a distinction of sexes. They talk about, a little bit later on in terms of this primary intensity. And then it seems like I got the sense that this theme kind of returns. This is on the bottom of page 157, where, he's talking about, this is a quote from the anthropologist, the individual went away into the distance carrying with him a part of the nourishing placenta, which is to say a part of his own mother. He saw this organ as his own, as forming a part of his own person, in such a way that he identified himself with one who gave birth to him. She was the matrix of the world. He senses unconsciously his symbolic membership in his mother's generation and detachment from the real generation of which he is a member. It's very interesting, and there are a couple other things like that. That again, when I was just trying to put this together, it seems like that's kind of the decoded flow of desire. The repression operates on that in such a way that you're immediately, again, like what Bruno was saying, like the limit, there's incest never enters. It's kind of like this, it's almost like a mathematical limit.
Right, yeah.
It goes down to zero. I mean, that's what a limit is that you're either this side of it or that side. But when you're really in the limit, there's kind of almost nothing there to be in.
And if I may add, mathematical, yes, and also ontological, insofar as it has the structure of the neither nor, the structure of neutrality, which is an ontological, important ontological structure. The limit is paradoxically maybe not a limit at all. I mean, the pure limit, just like the beginning and the end, right? I mean, there is ultimately in the constant flow and the desiring production, right? When uncoded, because Oedipus is a made-up thing ultimately, right? But otherwise, the limit is one, if I can put it this way, with the flow itself. So what is the limit really? And so this is why it is always crossed already or not yet crossed. And it remains in this moment of tension rather than, no, maybe.
No, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, if you want to really, I mean, again, the limit in transgression seems to be the movement that they're really trying to deal with here, in a sense. And those of you that know Michel Foucault writes preface to Transgression about if we really are transgressing, we should be uncertain, but we usually know what we're exceeding by crossing the limit, so to speak, by transgressing, right? In many ways, we know this, right? And this is a very interesting a moment here, because I don't think it's really either or, either we cross or we don't. I think this is all about, again, process and flow. And unless we keep thinking about it this way, and connections and conjunctions that are happening, we're going to Hegelianize Deleuze and Guattari, or we're going to make it into something that becomes something that they actually are fighting very, very strongly against. This kind of tendency to bring them back in to kind of representation or, standard kinds of logical, operations. And I think what Bruno is talking about, yes, the neither nor is certainly there, as is the and then, as is the if then. All of these things are working, simultaneously. What they're really trying to do is see how, I think in some ways, how this filiation becomes that of a structure of a life. Again, they're studying the anthropologists here. They're trying to, again, show, right, that somehow Oedipus becomes this limit, right, of the work of the untamed or the savage. this is where we get to the law of the untamed. Remember, the chapter is about the savage. The barbarian is a different limit at work. The barbarian, in this section, remember, there are three moments here of types of civilization: the untamed, or the washed, whatever you want to say, the wild. There's the barbarian, the tribal formation that is based on alliances, the barbarian machine, and then finally, of course, civilized men, which is really the capitalist desiring machine. So they're trying to look at these in terms of stages, right? Again, stages not only of representation, but probably better put, instances, right? There's a very interesting temporality here. It's not really stage theory that we go from here to there or whatever. It's much more of instances that they're looking at. It's much more about, the temporality and where a limit, and, how one gets to territorialization, right? How one gets to territorial representation. And they'll use other myths. They'll use the Abraham Isaac story, right? They'll use, I don't know Hebrew, but I understand from some of my friends that the word for salvation in Hebrew means to take space. It's spaciousness, which is interesting. It's territorial. Abraham is a territorial representation. And, so they're really, in some ways, they're trying to get both in this, work it through, and then come out to the point of where we can begin to talk about deterritorialization, right? And, find this moment of the schizoid, if you will, or schizophrenia as the absolute limit of how this becomes coded, right? In a sense, right? Whereas capitalism becomes the relative limit. And that you notice the Marxist language, relative and surplus value, right? There's no question about this. And I think they're really trying to set up, again, an attack upon representation. And what they see in psychoanalysis is a tendency, again, towards ultimately representation, no matter how carefully you read the 7th chapter of the Interpretation of Dreams. They still think that psychoanalysis somehow, is a retreat, right? In the face of the capitalist civilized machine. I mean, we can go back there because I think it becomes clearer as we go forward, and certainly in the later work of 1,000 Plateaus. But again, remember the subtitle of this book. This is a book cast under the shadow, if you will, of capitalism and schizophrenia. It's not only about, psychoanalysis or critiquing that, or critiquing the orthodoxy of the Second International and the communist movements, etc. They're against this institutional stuff. Guattari is a complete, I just want to say this subjectively, there is almost a visceral hatred of institutions that are going on here. A visceral, very visceral. You can really feel it. There's pushing through, anything that smacks of it, they want to get rid of it. And they hate piety. They hate piousness and piety, and they consider interpretation. This is a text that wants to be anti-interpretive. It's more about coding and encoding and decoding, and in relation to flows. So in some ways it has a big, I gave a long lecture. I'm very sort of tired today. I gave a 3-hour talk on artificial intelligence earlier today, a group of Canadians, students. And, I'm amazed at how much of this book feeds some of the stuff that's going on today. I talked about, the domination of the screen as production. It's our new mode of production, is the screen, which is an unpublished dissertation by a mutual friend of Bruno and myself, about how the screen is the new Fordism. It's a post-Fordist moment, right? In some ways. So anyway, I just want to, again, point this out, because the study here is not only about, and, I really appreciate, David's interventions, and Jane, and, other people that have some, the clinical and know this much better than I do. But this is a text that is really about, the capitalist machine, right? How it operates, how this social repression takes hold of psychic repression, and how psychic repression itself becomes formed. So they're looking at these steps of how this goes on, in a way. So in a lot of ways, it's a very Reichian book with a bunch of, if I started to develop equations of the thinking behind it, it would be Reich's drive for materialist psychiatry, right? With the best of Lacan, in terms of, what they can take and deconstruct out of the symbolic order. And at the same time, a kind of merging of some real advances in French ethnology and a lot of the forgotten figures in French anthropology, such as this school around Devereux, right? We were all about Levi-Strauss here, of course. Well, he was the dean of the Collège de France, of course. We're going to, he taught at Berkeley. But there were a lot of other people, because they go through African Oedipus, that the African Oedipus might not be universal to the Oedipus myth. They have a whole section on this. So I think again, many, many levels that we really need to try to comprehend. And if we start thinking of this only in the logic of and again, I'm all for dialectics, but if we only think this through in terms of the way we usually synthesize as leftists, I think we're going to miss something here. We have to really think what's being connected, in a sense, because they believe it about the connecting machines and the connecting parts of desiring production. And I think this is one of the ways why the hard left, if you will, or did not really take this up, except for a very small period of time. Yeah, they didn't like, this kind of movement. This was much more of an imaginative left. Yeah, this is go ahead. I'm sorry. This is a libidinal Marx in many ways. Yeah.
I just had a question to other people, and you, Michael, and everyone is, I guess I read this as that they're in some sense arguing that Oedipus doesn't yet really exist in the primitive territorialization, that it's perhaps lurking, but that
right, sure.
Oedipus, that's not what the repression is being directed against, and that's not the form the repression takes, right? It's not how it's coded, right? Is that other people's reading of this, that they're saying that at one point they say you need a very specific set of social conditions for Oedipus to arise.
I think so. Also, I think they say there we find no repression of the father, no foreclosure of the name of the father. So I think I don't know if I'm right, but the repression, I think it's not of the father, but it's of, let's say, I think the repression is in terms of creating alliances, like you said, Michael. So therefore the affiliation, the alliances is more important. So repression, not in the sense of the repression of the father, but I guess promoting alliances with other tribes. So you can't be with your father because you need to be and we need to create an alliance with another tribe. So therefore, that's more important. So repression, I guess, it's in the for the importance, I guess, of forming alliances. So you need to marry whoever, in exchange with whoever from the other tribe, so we can have more control of the.
Right. Well, that was the standard, Levi-Strauss says the working proposition was always women do not exist, right? That was the proposition that upset so many people, but in a way he really was talking, woman was a signifier of the exchange, the exchange of women. It was an exchange principle. That's what woman meant, right? In a way. Yeah. And of course, the feminist tradition really, yeah, Chris, you want to say something? I'm sorry. Yeah, please. Yeah.
If I can bring a little literature in here.
Yes, please. I forgot to bring the literature, which again, they lay down their arms before, like Freud did too.
Well, I think Shakespeare's Tempest fits all kinds of situations. The beginning of it, you can read it as Oedipal, the father on an island with the daughter, and reading him conjuring up all kinds of magic and whatever, until the shipwrecked Englishman come aboard, and she has no idea that such people exist. But what I think is most interesting is the situation of Caliban and Ariel. Caliban curses Prospero. He curses the Englishmen. He resists them. He remains on the island, whereas Ariel flies around doing the work of Prospero, and it in the end is freed. And I see that as a situation of capitalism. Ariel makes a deal with the capitalists, with the grand signifier, and she is let go at the end. Caliban resists capitalism and is left to his own resources.
And also Caliban's mother is a witch.
Yes.
The shamanist. She's the analyst, so to speak, in the primitive, basically the shamanist who is able to work with the magic beforehand, of which gives him this kind of early filiation, right? That is able to decode, if you want to take it to the Deleuze and Guattari, analysis, able to decode what the capitalist is up, what Prospero's magic is doing, because he already understands this magic of encoding, etc. Right?
Exactly.
Very good point. Yeah. So this is interesting to remember who Caliban's mother was, right? Yeah.
Yes, another kind of code.
Yeah. Or a kind of decoding before the code, right? In some ways, before the codes that Prospero is working with. He's able to decode, if you will, constantly the intentions of Prospero. He sees exactly where it's going on the island. So yeah, no, the Tempest is a very advanced play in terms of decolonization, and really is very much in line with a lot of this thinking here. I think, yeah. The Tempest is probably one of the early documents, if you will, unlike the Spanish epic Don Quixote, where you have all this hopeful optimism and the epic novel. The Tempest is a way of really starting the process of the colonial other and the decolonization. It's very interesting that you bring that up. At least to my mind, that's how it serves, right? In many ways. Yeah, good. Okay. Yeah. So I just was going to read one other back to where David got us started here. Carl, I'm sorry, got us started here. I'm on page, and I think hopefully this will clarify a little bit. And I don't want to, stay fixated, if you will, on the Oedipal thing so much. Hopefully we can move on a little bit. I'd like to get to Nietzsche, but anyway, if we look if we look at page, this is again, the section called The Problem of Oedipus, and this is about, 10, 12 paragraphs in, a little bit further from where Bruno was reading on incest. And this is page 165, but it's in my text, but probably about 10, 12 paragraphs into the section 3 of part 3, The Problem of Oedipus, in that section. And it begins, underlying the universal fact that marriage is not an alliance between a man and a woman, but an alliance between two families, right? A transaction between men concerning women, George Devereux drew the correct conclusion of a basic homosexual motivation of a group character. Through women, men establish their own connections. Through the man-woman disjunction, which is always the outcome of filiation, alliance places in connection men from different filiations. The question why a female homosexuality hasn't given rise to Amazon groups capable of negotiating for men perhaps finds its reply in women's affinity with the germinal influx. I mean, there's a dissertation here, I promise you, right? Resulting in the enclosed position of women in the midst of extended filiation hysteria, as opposed to alliance paranoia. Male homosexuality is therefore the representation of alliance that represses the ambiguous signs of intense bisexual filiation. However, George Devereux seems to us to be wrong on two occasions. First, when he admits having recoiled too long before this, so serious, he says, discovery of a homosexual representation. There we merely see a primitive version of the formal, all men are homosexuals, and to be sure, there are never more so than when they arrange marriages. Then again, and this is the most serious error, when he wants to make of this homosexuality of alliance a product of the Oedipus complex as something repressed. Alliance can never be deduced from the lines of filiation through the intermediary of Oedipus. On the contrary, alliance articulates them, impelled by the action of local lines and non-Oedipal primary homosexuality. And if this is true, that there exists an Oedipal or affiliative homosexuality, this should be understood merely as a secondary reaction to this group homosexuality, non-Oedipal at first. As for Oedipus in general, it is not the repressed, that is, the representative of desire, which is on this side of and completely ignorant of daddy, mommy, nor is it the repressing representation, which is beyond, which renders the persons discernible only by subjecting them to the homosexual rules of alliance. Incest is only the retroactive effect of the repressing representation on the repressed representative. The representation disfigures or displaces this representation to which it is directed, against which it is directed, and projects onto the representative categories rendered discernible, right? That it has itself established. It applies to the representative terms that did not exist before the alliance, organized the positive and the negative into a system and extension. The representation reduces the representative to what is blocked in the system. Hence, Oedipus is indeed the limit, but the displaced limit that now passes in the interior of the socius. Oedipus is the baited image with which desire allows itself to be caught. That's what you wanted. The decoded flows were incest. This is then a long story begins. And I'm interested, I'm more interested in how they develop to the narrative that they're going to work with and how they get there, right, in many ways. The story of Oedipalizations. But to be exact, everything begins in the mind of Laius, the old group homosexual, the pervert who sets a trap for desire. For desire in that, too, a trap. Territorial representation comprises these three instances: the repressed representative, the repressing representation, and the displaced representative. This is interesting. I mean, this is the limit called Oedipus, the limit. Right? How do you get to the opposition, etc.? Chris, again.
And Laius is the father of Oedipus, right?
Yeah. He was in the carriage with the bodyguard. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. House of Atreus. It's a long house in Greek mythology. Yeah. Please, Chris. Yeah. Chris, you had your hand up still?
Who, me?
Yeah, I see your hand up. Yeah.
Oh, no, I didn't.
Got to put your hand down. Okay. Yeah, you're not infantilized enough yet for the Zoom culture. Yeah, right. Anyway, yeah. So again, how we get here, how we get to this next section, this is the limit of Oedipus. How do we get to this limit, right, in a sense? And then Deleuze and Guattari are going to begin to talk about psychoanalysis and ethnology, cultural anthropology, and the findings of cultural anthropology. So it begins with the Devereuxian school of their friends, Adler and Quatre, and of course Levi-Strauss, and the whole question of incest. And now it's going to make a move. They're going to make a move into ethnology and more of the tradition, Geza Roheim, who was actually a disciple of Sándor Ferenczi of the Hungarian school in Budapest, who wrote the book Psychoanalysis and Anthropology, which is a kind of classic that I got, but I don't know if people read this anymore, but Roheim is very interesting, in his approaches yeah.
Michael, this is a question. I know you want to move on from Oedipus.
Yeah, no problem.
But they do spend a lot of time on Oedipus, so I guess
it's a lot to work through, in a way.
Yeah,
I tried to be friends with my father, but he wanted to be Oedipus. He wanted to be a father, right? Yeah. I mean, in a way, he brought in the alliance system. I know this very well firsthand in my own relationships and my own growing up. I didn't need, I was a father to myself when I was 13 years old. But anyway, in a sense, the threat to this Oedipal thing was really very powerful. It's very powerful. And, I know it's more powerful in a lot of the Mediterranean cultures and, the Judaic Greek, and James Joyce knew this very well with Greek Jew, two extremes meet in a way. And, Freud's a brilliant reader of Greek tragedy. But on another level, yes, this is very important. That this is a lot to work through because it dominates everyday life. I mean, really, in a sense, still does. Why do we get so upset with the father Trump? He's not our father, but why are we so attacked? Why do we go for these targets? We have to ask these questions, in a sense. We haven't really looked at structures, right? Encodings and stuff like that. It was all about Donald Trump the last 4 years.
Yeah.
What creates this displacement of the representation? I'm throwing out some questions here, but I mean, I think they're valid questions though.
Yeah. Right. In that section you just read, there was this one thing that I thought was really fascinating. Again, I'm just trying to understand how they're setting all this up. But they write it that Oedipus is indeed the limit, but the displaced limit that now passes into the interior of the socius.
Yes.
So it seems like what they're proposing is that you have the repressed representative, which in this part of the book is kind of this intense germinal flow, the kind of decoded desire.
Or better put, filiation. How we filiate.
Right.
And this is a very powerful word in philosophy, philia.
Yeah.
It's a very powerful Greek word. I mean, in a sense, it means both lover and friend too. And we leave out the lover usually in the philia when we speak. We speak mostly about the friend. You have a platonic relationship, or you have a affiliation with someone, you have a friendship. Why can't we be friends? Or let's be friends, not lovers. But it's always working together. I want to just be clear.
Yeah,
the
way I saw it is that they use that though in relation to this. It's kind of it's an undifferentiated. They're not persons. They're sort of like these connections. It's almost like at the level of desiring production, the connective synthesis that doesn't recognize global persons. It's all about partial objects. And then the repressing representation seems to be, the alliance system. And then it seems like what they're saying is that Oedipus is then this displaced represented, but it's sort of like, again, it's this very interesting image of it passes into the interior of the socius.
Right. It's displaced. Yeah.
It almost becomes latent. And the way I read it is they're not talking about it's latent in individual psyches. It's kind of latent within the social field as a potentiality that then under certain, that can become manifest under certain conditions. But they do seem it's that there is something going on here that is yeah, that's how I read it. Now, maybe other people have a completely different read of it or see something else, but that's
Matt just put in the chat. They represent any notion of individual, and Bruno will certainly agree with that. Yeah, there is no notion of the individual here at all.
Yes. Yeah.
At all. This is language that's far and far behind many things. Chris, you raised your hand.
Yes,
again?
of course I will. Yeah.
I
For real?
wanted to say that
Okay.
I wanted to say that Oedipus is this great signifier, as they duly point out, and without Oedipus, there is no great signifier. It's an attack on Saussurean system, and as a Derridian, I applaud it.
Okay, very good. Okay, I understand. There's a Derridian. Yeah, what monstrosity will appear in the future? Very good. Yeah, I hear this. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, very interesting. Well, they're very much influenced by that. They mentioned Derrida in this book too. I mean, as I mentioned in the opening to this reading of Anti-Oedipus, you know, in a way, the theoretical matrix behind a book like this is really Althusser and the Reading Capital group and everything that elicited. Certainly Foucault's structure, words and things, as structuralism, and of course Derrida's De la grammatologie. And these were things that were very operative during this time, as well as the best of phenomenology, right? The residues of existential psychoanalysis that never really got off the ground, which is an interesting question that came up in my lecture when I talked to students today in Canada. You know, where's responsibility in all this? You know, ultimately, you know, vis-a-vis, you know, which was a very Sartrean notion. And also this came up in the context of Hans Jonas and technology, where we're talking about technology. And Hans Jonas was one wing of technology. He wrote a book on the imperatives of responsibility or something like that, you know, one of Heidegger's students. But anyway, all to say, yeah, this text is really situated in those kind of moments. So, you know, the Derridian, you know, the writing machine, the privileging of writing over speech, which he wants, you know, and he wants. This is a chapter on the inscriptions. You know, when I put in the outline, we are all tattooed savages, like Flaubert said. Maybe I should have said we're all tattooed wild things or something like that. I don't know what, you know, instead of using savages. But anyway, you know, the wildness. This is very much true. How are we written here? This is, again, how they're trying to look at something as well. Through André Leroy-Gourhan's findings about gesture and speech and culture, through all these findings in French anthropology, et cetera, and even in American, you know, the Argonauts that, you know, in the Pacifics that Malinowski studies, yeah, et cetera. And, you know, even those of you that read Herman Melville, to go back to the early primitive communism of the early little novels of Tipe and other things for his travels in the Pacific. You know, this is interesting. And in some ways, maybe they are going back with Lewis Henry Morgan to a kind of primitive communism. I don't know if they mentioned the Iroquois. I forgot if they mentioned the study of the Iroquois. But again, they're maybe looking at these kind of forms too, to say, wait a minute, let's take a step back. We're forgetting all this. So yeah, Carl, yeah.
Oh no, I'm okay.
Oh, you just waved. Okay. Yeah, Chris, you wanted to say something more?
No, I took down my hand.
You took down the hand. Okay, I was just wondering if I saw you're still unmuted. Yeah. Anyway, I know how dense. I mean, look, again, this is a wealth of background. They're having conversations about everything that is going on in France during that time. This is high level Sorbonne. You know, I'm not trying to build it up more than it really is, but it is an investigation, if you will, into some of the most advanced, using the most advanced theoretical tools of the time to try to get to, you know, can we get off the couch? Can we forget the neurotic and get down to the work of really getting into the open air, right? Can we be more like Nietzsche, where we are contingent through the open seas and well beyond good and evil, or are we always going to be brought back into these encodings, right, of a new territorial representation, whether if it's adaptive, whether if it's integrated, if it's eclectic or whatever. This is what they're trying to get out of, you know, in a sense. Whether or not it works or not is another story, of course, and whether we should adhere to this. I mean, you know, yeah. but there's a consistent destructuration going on here. There's a consistent de-representation, if you will, right? They're really trying to get much and more. Remember they said, what a mistake to say man and world. Why do we need the and? It's just world, right? This is what they're working with. Monde, le monde, and Welt, right? World, worlding, to put it in Heidegger's language. This is being as worlding, right? Mm-hmm. Not only nature, naturing, but being as worlding world, right? In many ways. So this is what's going on, if we can think of it this way, yeah. So
we're not looking for too much systematicity in all this, which you're saying that in some way trying to get away from. But it seems to me that, like, what's emerging as I read through this book is that they're taking these initial ideas that they put forward about desiring production, the nature of the unconscious, the body without organs, and then these three syntheses, and then they're kind of working them through a series of encounters that it does have a historical aspect to it, right? They're talking about,
well, sure,
and it's interesting that so we didn't talk about that, but they talk about the inscribing surface is the full body of the earth, right?
Right. We're going to go into that. The despot is part of the thing. And again, yeah, no, right, no, and I mean, a very favorite book of mine, worth rereading, a peripheral member to the Frankfurt School, is Oriental Despotism by Wittfogel. This is a magnificent book. Magnificent book, by the way. They
talk about, like, in this section on, primitive territorialization, that, again, you see this body without organs, but it becomes the full body of the earth, and then that is transposed into the body of the sovereign. And so you sort of see this kind of recurrent motif, which is very interesting. So there is, I think they do have a certain, I wouldn't call it a theory, but there is definitely an analytical structure that they.
Oh yeah, no, I agree with you. But again, like, there's the case in France, you need the passport, right? They're trying to find a new discipline, schizoid analysis, right? They're trying to go beyond what is dominant at that time. So in order to get there, they're going through all the hoops, if you will, that one necessarily has to go through in terms of this founding of this new way of looking at the relationship of capitalization to psychic repression. How the new forms of psychic repression are creating a new socius or a social field that we are very difficultly trying to navigate, etc. Right? And in many ways, I mean, I've noticed this in the university. I mean, I'm teaching students now, and I have to ask myself this question. At the university level, I'm teaching students that probably have the level of the 6th grade or 7th grade education that I had in terms of what I knew. I try to go back. So one has to ask the question, what the hell is going on? Right? Yeah, in terms of, what's happening here, right? In a sense. I mean, they may be able to do high-powered mathematics for STEM technology, but the ability to read, the ability to think, and maybe Bruno can, Tony, other people that teach in the room can attest to this. It's very, very difficult to teach at this level anymore, right? You're basically, yeah. And I refuse to dumb down. So I'm always in this task of trying to, work towards the text or, study up, as C. Wright Mills has it. So a real question is this counter-revolutionary moment, right, that has occurred since, in my opinion, since the 70s, is very real. It's very, very much here. In a sense. Yeah. So, yeah, Patrick, please. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I mean, I taught high school. I could tell you stories about that, but Carl, I think Carl's really onto something here.
Oh, good.
In the sense that, Marx in the introduction to the Grundrisse talks about the way in which within capitalism, labor is within capitalism allows us to basically go into the past and understand the past much better in terms of what goes on. And what they're doing is that they've kind of, this is my understanding, they have broadened Marx's whole analysis, bringing in the notion of synthesis, inscription, and the body without organs and all this stuff. And the way in which these different categories, the same way in which labor functions for Marx, they are able to get access to what is going on. And they're building on contemporary anthropology in France, etc. And I think, I mean, this is a way to get a handle on it, I think. So.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think you make a really great point. I mean, in a way, what you're really getting here is a libidinal Marx in some senses. You're getting libidinal, Marx in the way of a rereading of Man and the Machines, as well as, as you said, the introduction to the Grundrisse, on the production, consumption, distribution, and exchange value working as a totality, which still has, of course, remnants of Hegelian language, in it, as we know, but anyway, all to say, I think if we try to look at it this way, that one of the things that was missing in terms of what they see in terms of the PCF, if you want to historicize this, the Parti Communiste Française and the Euro, at least the communist movements post-World War II, was this lack of psychoanalytic, clarity, right, in a way. And there was this incredible drift towards Lacan, against the ineptitude of the French psychoanalytic scene, dominated by Marie Bonaparte and others, over the years, and, who was kind of the bad boy, if you will, kicked out of the IPA. But at the same time, they're trying to go beyond this because they see this as being, again, feeding the system. When Lacan says in 68, 69, and the other side of psychoanalysis, you're looking for a master, Marx and Freud, and I am here. And then he says capitalism is the master signifier. All kinds of bells and whistles go off in Deleuze and Guattari's heads. We don't want this to be the master signifier anymore. We want to deconstruct that constantly, in a sense. And, the stakes here in some ways, as Chris Knight was pointing out, is against Saussurean linguistics and that import in terms of, Lacanian psychoanalysis and the notion of the signifier and the sign, and trying to go beyond that. So they have many levels of antagonists here. That's all, in a sense. Whether we can make sense of all of it, but that they do have their antagonists because they do not want to go back. They do not want to be captured again, that the nomad as a figure, the schizoid as a figure, the schizes that we've talked about, all are to be constituted as those that cannot be recoded in the system. They jam all the codes. This is what they think Nietzsche did. This is Deleuze on Nietzsche. He jams all the codes. He says, Nietzsche is basically saying to us, the family makes you sick, the new family will make you well, Freud, or make you tolerate your everyday misery better, or help you get rid of your neurosis and work with it better. Lenin and the Bolshevik Revolution. The state has made you sick. The new state will make you well. I'm being very reductive with Lenin. I like Lenin very much. But anyway, but again, that's what happened, right? In a sense, the new state will make you well, right? The old state, the capital state made you sick. The new quote unquote socialist state will make you well. They're trying to go again in this neither nor, right? As Bruno was pointing out, this logic, right, that ultimately says, no, we want to jam both of the codes and go much further than this, right? We don't see the state nor the family. And to go back to Engels in a sense, and, the reference I made to Weekend, that we want neither of those two to, be in the mix in terms of this recoding, this reconstituting, this displaced representation again, or representative, as Carl pointed out, the limit of Oedipus. We don't want to go back to the limit of Oedipus or the limit of, quote, the USSR or the the PRC, yeah, the People's Republic of China, yeah, in a way. So this is what they're in some ways saying. Yeah, yeah. Please go ahead, Bruno. So
but in fact,
in this way, yeah, very Nietzschean.
Another thing certainly is that I mean, the question of Oedipus is the question of the father. What you were saying also makes one think of an anarchist understanding of all this. As Foucault says, I don't remember where exactly now, but the king's head must still be cut off, right? I mean, so the idea ultimately here too is to kill the father, to destroy Oedipus, but to kill the father as well. Which is, since I mentioned Foucault, one thinks of the opening of Not Discipline and Punish with the poor Damien, the parricide.
No, the regicide, not parricide.
No, but he uses both words. The first page, parricide and regicide, which is the same. Yeah. He uses both. Yeah, and because the king is the father in to a great extent, if you will, right? Yes. So that's also maybe something to keep in mind, that it is really the death of the father, the one is
right. But again, the interesting part, and maybe we should go there now here, is in terms of the Nietzschean moment, which is beyond this in a sense, because Nietzsche, the way they're going to read Nietzsche is beyond this in terms of the debtor-creditor relationship. It's no longer the symbolic value of the father, right? They're going to really look at this through the lens of debtor to creditor, right? In a way. And what, again, they're fighting against is that even if you kill the father or you're involved in the parricide, both either literally or symbolically, you still are trapped, again, within the symbolic logic of Oedipus at the limit for them. This is one of the things they're going against. They're going against the symbolic order of Lacan. And unfortunately, again, this would take another 2-3 weeks to really go through. But the symbolic order in Lacan is also what they're really trying to engage here. They're trying to only stay at the level of the real and the imaginary. Yeah. So again, it's a deconstruction of the symbolic orders, right? In which
but if I may also, that's a question. I was wondering now, reading again the expression in particular, the non-Oedipal primary homosexuality, and how that would, of course, perhaps relate to. I was reading again the Ego and the Id the other day, what Freud calls our constitutional bisexuality, right? I mean, before the whole Oedipalization starts, right? I mean, what they call the grotesque triangle, right? But I mean, there is a relation, perhaps, as well, right? I mean, what comes, if Oedipus is a limit, a displaced limit, what comes before, and then after, in a sense, Oedipus, the invention, the making of Oedipus. No?
Yeah, but I mean, I think we've talked a little bit about this, right? And in terms of this section that we just read about filiation and the process into alliances, and then that Oedipus becomes that limit, right? In which the displaced represented takes place at that limit, right? The territorial representation takes care of these moments. So there's a territorialization happening first in filiation, right? Early on, right? Without the coding of the incest prohibition, et cetera, right? And then the family, the alliances begin a kind of different kind of coding in which the brotherhood is formed, right? In terms of establishing the law and the prohibition of incest, right? And then Oedipus becomes the displaced, representative of this last instant, if you will, of territorial representation, right? This is where they're going. They're really trying to develop a concept of territory here. and territorialization, if that makes better sense. There's a kind of dialectic of territorialization happening here, yeah, if you will, yeah, in a sense, right? So that, you know, how does one show how that happens? Because where they're going to want to go with the schizoid and the schizoid flows, you know, look, again, for them, and I'm not saying they're right, please, I mean, you know, I don't know, you know, I mean, really, to be honest, this is a very experimental text, right? That's coming from both a very advanced experimental clinic on the one hand, a militant, someone who has obviously a lot on his mind about Jacques Lacan, right? Institutional psychotherapy, institutional practice, and another one who's a philosopher of first rank, who's coming out of both Spinoza, Nietzsche, Bergson, and David Hume, as well as, you know, part of the Duns Scotus as well. And, you know, he's writing, you know, basically fundamental, very logical, I mean, or at least to the philosophical mind, very, you know, rigorous texts on ontology, difference and repetition, a book on logic, Logique des Sens, and of course, the book on Spinoza and expressionism. And I'm going to talk more about that as we go forward, you know, about why this is again, Anti-Oedipus is a kind of philosophical text because of Deleuze's theories of expressionism. But, you know, we'll get to that later. I don't want to complicate, I mean, you know, too much here. But anyway, so to go back to this for a second, you know, again, the experiment here is, again, we do not want to return to the institutionalization of the neurotic on the couch, right? Or the practice of this, or the psychosis. They see that still part of this displaced representative. They're at the limit there. They want to go beyond the limit, if you will, right? Of Oedipal representation, beyond the limit of territorial representation. And for them, the figure is in history, you know, and I guess Chris is still here. Yes, Chris is still here. The drama of Antonin Artaud, right? Who basically is a madman, right? Or Nietzsche, who goes mad at the end and becomes a signpost, you know, at a certain level. Hölderlin, you know, many figures in the history of the arts, etc. The ego loss of a Henry Miller, the alcoholic machinery, if you will, of Malcolm Lowry in terms of Under the Volcano. So they're picking up on all these things about how the machine keeps working without being recoded, right, in a sense. And they're looking at it, and if we really think about, you know, and I mean, you and Tony especially, I'm sure other people in the room know about, you know, modernist fiction and postmodernist fiction, right, in a way, and the experiments that went on, you can begin to see this operative in Joyce, of course, Molly Bloom's soliloquy as early as Ulysses. You can see this in Joyce, certainly in Finnegan's Wake, which is a scramble of the English language. In the Spanish tradition, Juan Gostiolo, Juan the Landless, the nomad themselves, right? You see this in a lot of Latin American literature, you know, that's going on, and the magic realism. You see this also in many experimental works of fiction on the continent. The United States, of course, you know, it's anything you want it to be, you know, from, I mean, Bruno, you know, the San Francisco schools, right, of the beats and etc. So you begin to see this whole you know, this kind of thing that's going on that I think is also in this book. You know, why are we, you know, in a sense, I think one question they're asking themselves is, why aren't excuse my language, why aren't we in the open air? Right? Why aren't we out there in the open air? Why are we codifying and making this much more of, quote, the business, right, of psychic, you know, intervention and psychic healing always, instead of saying, let's just open the doors, right, of the institution. And this is one place they're coming from. In some ways, it's a very simple project in a sense. You know, take a deep breath and get outside, right? The schizoid on the stroll for a good walk on the grounds at Austin Riggs is a much better example of, you know, the healing process in terms of, you know, and of course they're observing this as this goes on. You know, this is about going back to where Carl began here, this earlier moment of the germinal, right? And the germinal flux. This is what the schizophrenic, I don't know if you've ever walked with a schizophrenic or and you've tried to talk, and think about Lang entering into that world and the divided self and talking about, he describes in the divided self, the patient that comes in that looks like Kierkegaard, kind of a disheveled Kierkegaard. He describes the patient this way, that's completely divided. So in a way, they're trying to get into worlds, right? They're not trying to bring a established structural, right, nor theory of representation or a clinical practice that is already somewhat predetermined and in its vocabulary. They're trying to do something very new. So if that makes sense, I don't know, in a way,
It does. I guess, and this is,
sure.
if any of the people who are, clinicians or, more involved in
Right.
psychoanalytic practice, I'd be very interested in knowing what their thinking is or the current thinking is. But do you think it's fair to say that
they make a living off of this? They're not supposed to offer their clinical advice for free. I'm just kidding. But anyway,
yeah.
Right.
No, I'm not looking for free analysis.
Yeah, no, I'm just kidding.
More like, but
I'm playing.
it seems like they're posing the schizophrenic as a more genuine representation of uncoded desire, I guess, to use their category or their phrase. And
think of it this way, going back to what Bruno was saying about the limit and what we read, right? You're in that tension, right, of the limit, right, with the schizoid, right? This is what the schizoid does. It is the absolute limit, but it's the neither nor, and it's also you cross the line or you don't cross the line,
right,
etc. All of these things are where we are with the schizoid. Right?
But the
Whereas,
coding, yeah, exactly. And they use earlier on, they talk about and. It's conjunctive in that way. It's not like either or, which is sort of the law and the code and the structure.
That's right.
So I guess I don't know quite how to articulate it. There just seems like something very problematic, though, about posing that as a model of desire. I personally would not want to be in that state. And it seems like there's a very different understanding of what schizophrenia might entail. I mean, I know that it's kind of, in some sense, not literal.
There's not a celebration here of the
right. No, and I know that they're not talking about literally we should all
No, and I don't think they're advocating for that either.
Right. No, I get that.
I want to point, yeah.
But they're trying to pose some image of thinking about a different kind of symbolization or.
I mean, if we could try to read it in at least a double register as both symptomatic of the absolute limit of capitalism in terms of psychic repression, right? In some ways, if we want to look at that this is what happens, right? And that the schizoid is the best example of this, whereas because the neurotic can be brought back into the fold, whereas the schizoid can't, and there's a kind of opening there that they see. Karl Jaspers, the great German philosopher, said in one of his essays, Ezekiel was a schizophrenic. The schizophrenic is the one that can allow the light to come in, right? The prophet Ezekiel in the Old Testament. So let's keep that in mind. We're both reading on the register of symptom, and then what kind of practice would this lead to? Yes, Patrick, go, please.
Yeah, I kind of understand that as, Lacan talks about foreclosure, and foreclosure is when the father essentially is set up in terms of in the development of language. And their notion of schizophrenia is things are in flux. There's a certain openness to the way in which we code things. And
right.
And that's where they see the capitalism, because it goes through these cycles of not disjunctive, but conjunctive, in the sense of this and then this and this in terms of the accumulation process. They're seeing that schizophrenia not as a clinical problem in terms of someone who is clinically considered to be crazy,
Right.
but as it is a subterranean element within capitalism, which opens up possibilities.
Yes, that's a good way of putting it, as a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah.
Much like the great movie with Alan Bates, King of Hearts. Who understands the peace movement better than those people locked up, right? I don't know if you remember King of Hearts, but it was very, very great film in that regard. The mad people are the ones that really understood that war doesn't pay, right? And of course it pays, it's big business, but you know, on the other hand, they understood it as a machine and all of that. Yeah, going back to the notion of foreclosure, I think that the interesting thing that they're trying to do here is in the schizoid, right, or in the schizoid as the absolute limit here of capital, is that the schizoid does not understand nor does want to understand the father's no, right? Which is part of the foreclosure, right? This is very important to keep in mind. The schizoid does not understand the no. You know, the psychotic may have lost touch with the no, right? But yeah. And anyway, this again were great essays. People that are interested in some of the literary - clinical ideas about that. Jean Laplanche wrote a great, who wrote the New Vocabulary of Psychoanalysis and the Language of Psychoanalysis. He was part of the Lacanian school, and also great vineyards in the south of France. But anyway, he had a very good essay called Holderlin and the Father, and the question of the father and the father's no. So this is a very interesting study of someone who went mad, right? The great poet of of German Romanticism, who both Lukács and Heidegger were very fond of. Holderlin is kind of a starting point for the German mind, in a way, post Hegel, or was a very good friend of Hegel's. He was one of the big three, around German idealism and then German Romanticism. So anyway, David, you want to say something? I know you've been, very pensive tonight. Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah.
Not so much. Where I was feeling, as often happens as we get more into this in a good way, it's more confusing and more complex. So I'm attentive, but I don't feel like I quite have a synthesis or a formed question just yet, Michael. I'm taking a little time.
No problem at all. I think people were reaching out because they wanted the quote viewpoint from the from the clinician side, or the more well-versed psychoanalytic side. Yeah, but anyway, yeah. But anyway, I was just playing. I was working with the group desire here in a sense. Yeah. Anyway, but yeah, I mean, I think it is more confused. I think it gets more complicated and confused. And I think you're absolutely right about this. And I'll try my very best to keep it as situated as possible. Again, I think this is a very strange, if I could put it that way, both estranged and strange amalgamation of Nietzsche, Freud, and Marx, of a quote modern unholy trinity, if you will. We have the Trinitarian formula, land, labor, and capital on the one hand from Marx in the third volume of Capital, and we also have the modern trinity, the three makers, if you will, of modern consciousness. Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche in some ways. All of which, and I kind of read this ontologically. Being as value, Marx, right? In some ways, being as power, Nietzsche, and being as desire, Freud. So in a way, how do we begin to ontologize this in such a way that this amalgamation leads to less confusion, or the confusion is a source of renewal, as could be, because to be confused sometimes can be very renewing. Right, in a way, we're not fusing so easily or identifying so easily with a text and synthesizing so easily. Yeah, and I think in some ways, if you could try to do this, part of the experiment is to try to look at these levels of synthesis, like the connective, the disjunctive, and the conjunctive, working in all registers. And again, I read this part 3 as one way of rewriting, if you will, Marx's view of history in the three stages, the three eras: the ancient, the feudal society, into capitalism, into the rise of the bourgeois class, in a way that they're substituting the untamed, right, or the savages, the barbarian, right, machine, as the second part, which is developing, during the feudal society in the Middle Ages, in a way, and then the civilized machine, which comes, as part of, the new trading routes of the 16th century, but more so in the project of the Enlightenment, during the Kantian, German, Enlightenment, the Scottish Enlightenment, the English Enlightenment, and of course the German Enlightenment, all of which we still, try to grasp and go back to try to reorient ourselves. And this becomes part of our everyday frustration that most of us are educated in enlightened institutions, or with some form of enlightenment, but everywhere we look around, there's nothing but man in dark times, as Hannah Arendt used to say, right? In some ways. So yeah. So if we could keep that in mind, it's a very strange amalgamation, right? And it's in a way, Nietzsche and Marx aren't too close, right? In some ways. However, they're trying to make him close. I'm about ready to tackle Domenico's Lasorda's 1,100-page book on Nietzsche, The Aristocratic Rebel. Nietzsche got sick the day of the Paris Commune. It was so visceral. He thought the French Revolution was a form of ressentiment and a kind of new Christianity. His politics leave a lot to be desired, right, in many ways. But he's very present in this book as a progressive, thinker, or someone that gives us great insight. Yeah. So again, I understand your confusion, and I certainly have my own. So yeah.
Michael, this is a question. I mean, one of the other things that, as we've been moving through this book, that has really jumped out to me is, the notion of repression. And it seems that for all, the complexity and how they're reworking these things, there is still almost kind of like a Reichian underpinning that although in some ways they at points say that this is not true, but that there's sort of like this desiring body, desiring production. It's uncoded, it's generative, and that that it is being repressed. So there is kind of this tension, and that it seems like in some sense the project is to liberate desire. Right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And so, but I wonder how this, I mean, one way of looking at this, I guess there are two other ways of looking at that relationship. You could say that what they're calling coding is a necessary development that makes human life possible in some sense. And you don't necessarily have to interpret that as a Freudian, but just moving from a less determinate, more undifferentiated, to a more determinate, more differentiated. That would be the movement. Now that's kind of, as I was taught, that's kind of a Hegelian.
That is Hegelian.
That's very Hegelian, right?
You were taught well, Hegelian. Yeah.
Very simple.
Yeah,
you start with the absolutely undifferentiated,
right,
and then,
right.
So, and then I guess a very different approach, and this is, I guess, really where my question is that my understanding is that Foucault and certain people tried to do away with the notion of repression altogether.
Just an idea.
That power generates subjectivities and desires. And so that the idea that power is operating on some kind of pre-coded level of desire has to be in some, that's how I read Foucault, the introduction to the history of sexuality. And it seems that they have a very different.
Repression was only a hypothesis. That's
right.
Foucault's point, right? It's a hypothesis. Right. The first chapter of the history of sexuality was the repressive hypothesis, the hypothesis of repression. What, as I mentioned before, kind of tongue in cheek, when Hilda Doolittle, tribute to Freud, in a way, HD, she said, what Drury German invented this term sublimation, right? Well, the same could be said of the notion of repression. What does it function? It's a very strange concept, and it works at many levels. It's just, you can't say, Phil Jocelyn's repressed. We're all repressed in some ways. We need to repress in terms of, functioning in society in some ways, right? So this is the thing. But for Foucault, who's a historian of sexuality, he's trying to situate this in terms of how, the mores, and I think this is wrong, but anyway, the mores of Vienna during that time, brought this hypothesis to the fore, right, in a way, and that somehow the Catholic confessional became, taken to the couch, right? He read this as a pastoral thing in a way. I think nothing is further from the truth versus vis-a-vis psychoanalysis without, even with my own ambivalent relationship to psychoanalysis as a practice, or especially the way it's practiced in the United States, or, I don't know, globally anymore. But so anyway, yeah.
But if I may also respond to Carl's point, but
Yeah.
I think that's true. But I think that idea is formulated by Foucault also in Discipline and Punish before the history of sexuality, and not necessarily in the psychoanalytic sense, but in the Althusserian sense, maybe. Power is still repressive, right? It is also productive, maybe more so than repressive. Maybe that's the most important feature of it. So there is then the production of subjectivity, the docile body, right? The body of obedience and docility is not only a body that is repressed, but it is produced by the subject. The body of the soldier, no? In the opening of the beautiful chapter on the docile bodies, right? Is made, is molded, right? Yeah. So there is this productive moment, but there is also the repression, right? So it's not that right, not only at the psychic level, but
specifically
political.
To what Foucault, says in History of Sexuality, that the psychoanalytic session is akin to the Catholic confessional. He goes through this, and Foucault is a big, after a lot of the stuff in the 70s, Foucault was really looking at the care of the self, through more pastoral needs rather than with psychoanalysis or with this kind of therapeutic divide. The therapeutic really for him was much more on the level of the pastoral level and care at that level, right, rather than the longer term psychoanalytic encounters or the vocabulary of psychoanalysis, right, in many ways. That's all I was speaking to. I understand the political technology of the body is something we've forgotten very, very actively. We really don't talk about that political technology of the body, which is really the main thing going on during this pandemic period. Every day you get the COVID report. Every day you get the latest statistic. Every day, I go to sleep at night since I got the vaccine. What symptom may I show, given the dominant media? Et cetera, et cetera. We're really being orchestrated in many ways in terms of a, political technology of the body, of which, of course, big pharma, the therapeutic institutions, all of these are complicit in, none of us is innocent in a certain way. We're all guilty to some degree or not, in a sense, right? So, I agree with you. This is really very true. How is the docile body created? And look what's going on in the United States. We have a very good chance, after all this nonsense with Trump, in 2022, there's a very good chance, I'm willing to bet it, that there's going to be a return of the Trump Republicans en masse, right, in certain key states into the Congress. And we have to ask that question, why, right? Why does this happen? Given all that's out there, everything that people know, et cetera. And I think this is a real question in terms of overcoming servile intensity. we're developing this, you and me, Bruno, in a way. The servile index. How do you measure these degrees of servility in this era, right? Yeah.
And I mean, I just want to say, comes to mind, many years ago, I read this wonderful book by Ellen Berger, The Discovery of the Unconscious. I mean, tracing the trajectory precisely from
Henry Ellenberger.
Exactly, yeah. From confession into then the psychoanalytic model. Very interesting book.
Yeah, it's a great book. Yeah, very good book. Yeah, very well known. Yeah, that's another thing that we have in many of the, I mean, and David and Jane can correct me on this, but a lot of the phenomenology and that school is not really incorporated in a lot of the Freudian institutes, and then vice versa, the phenomenologists sometimes take away, I know there's collaboration and there's connections that go on, but it seems to me that there begins to be territorial representation, territorialities that are created, and the eclecticism that's really necessary, or the ability to think, through. A lot of great work was done. I mean, Sartre's existential psychoanalysis is pretty amazing if you read Saint-Genet, as an attempt to look at a person's life and how one makes choices and how one, becomes free, and what a project is, and all of these things. Pretty amazing stuff, and of course, not talked about at all, right? In a sense. Yervin Yalom, who I really like very much, the group therapist who's written books on when Nietzsche meets, his book, Existential Psychotherapy, I think was a great thing that came out in the 1980s. It opened up a lot of possibilities for people. But again, it's not, Irving Yalom is not, really taught or talked about that much, even though I think he's still alive. He's in his 90s, I think. But anyway, he wrote a novel on Spinoza, right? And one on Nietzsche, When Nietzsche Weeps. So this is someone very educated, but we don't really, again, this is not part of the general culture because of, again, what Lukács criticizes, what the Frankfurt School criticizes, what we criticize, in our own way, the over-specialization of knowledge, the over-specialized disciplines in a way, which to me, Bruno, going back to this docile bodies, is a new way, a kind of non-violent but very violent way of creating new docility, over-specialize in the knowledge, not be able to be conversant like Deleuze and Guattari with psychoanalysis and ethnology, psychoanalysis and Marxism and all these kind of things. So this to me is another aspect of the system and the division of labor that we're getting today, that is really corrupted thought, and really reduced thought to this very repressive apparatus. And why we're seeing this Patrick can probably affirm this teaching to the test, build students for the goddamn regents, right? That they don't know any. When we're giving the multiple choice test, Professor, why so many essays? Well, you got to learn how to write, etc. We never did that in high school.
And I never did it when I taught.
What happened? I'm sorry.
I never did it when I taught.
Yeah,
I refused to teach the test.
Good for you. Good. I'm glad you kept your job. You must have had a good union, or you were a phenomenal teacher.
I was at the center of the union in the school. Excellent. And it was in a wealthy school. So.
Oh yeah, the parents understand. The wealthy parents understand, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing how class works in this too. Interesting.
Oh.
Yeah,
Michael, because you also used the word eclectic, and we spoke once about this, right? But that's a very important thing, especially in education. Not only, it's not simply the so-called interdisciplinary, institutionalized, interdisciplinary way of doing things, but the genuinely eclectic method should be actually really emphasized and practiced.
This is genuine eclecticism, what we're reading.
I agree.
So many ways. That's why it's so confusing in a certain way. I think. I mean, in a sense,
Yeah.
they're drawing upon so many different forces, right, to come up with something coherent. And I think I told you how they wrote this. Felix was going through writer's block, and Deleuze says, you write everything out in the morning, send it to me. We'll review it at the end of the day. And then they began to, it began to take shape this way. So it was really a very interesting project in this regard. It helped Guattari get over writer's block and probably a lot of antagonism. It could not have been easy to undergo an analysis and then a break with Jacques Lacan. Right? I mean, it cannot have been easy. I mean, I want to just say this, on Guattari's. I don't know the circumstances or et cetera. I know he went to see Lacan later. I know some of the stories, and there was not a productive meeting. But in a way, yeah, this is someone that, maybe in classical clinical language is very traumatized by the counter, and that the countertransference is massive, right? That's happening here, and what's going on. So, but I don't want to make this. I don't want to say that this is what the book's about only. It's not just for and against Lacan. I think it's more than that, right? It's much more. It's certainly, certainly there, But the beauty of Lacan, to me at least, was, and to Freud in a way, they were very interested in the findings in anthropology, literature, painting, the performance side, in Guattari and especially Deleuze's case, film, right? This was a healthy eclecticism, or what I would call a creative eclecticism, not something that just borrows for borrowing's sake, but borrowing for creative purposes. So I agree. Yeah, very much. But
Michael,
yeah,
I have a question. This
sure.
gets back to, and other people who know Lacan would be interested in. But you had said, maybe this is jumping ahead, but you were going to talk about the difference between Saussure and I don't know how you say.
If I get to Montreal, I promise a special session on Jelmselfian analysis. I mean, linguistic analysis, and his book on prolegomena for a theory of language, which is very important both to Deleuze and to Guattari. The plane of immanence and the plane of expression. I need the book, unfortunately, and I haven't been out, and I haven't. I know exactly. I can see it visually in my place there. I know where it is. I know which closet, in which bedroom, exactly on which part of the shelf it's on, right? It's next to Marcel Cohn, a great Marxist linguist, History of the French Language through a Marxist lens. So anyway, yeah. So yeah, I will do that. I mean, we'll try to talk about that, and maybe we saw Shore, and I guess did Chris leave? Yeah. This is again an attack on Saussurean linguistics, in the sense that it's still dealing with language as a positive, is a system, differential system without positive terms. Everything is canceling each other out, right? Whereas Hemslef is talking about planes of immanence and expression, and the plane of expression is very operative in Deleuze's study on Spinoza, which is one of the great formal commentaries on Spinoza that exists. Now, there's a lot of good commentaries on Spinoza, but the book, The Theory of Expressionism in Spinoza, is worth a read. I mean, it's really pretty phenomenal, the level and the depth of his understanding of the structure of the ethics. Yeah, I mean, pretty amazing. Bruno, you've read that book? Yeah. Yeah. Have you read Deleuze's book on the theory of
Yes, great.
Pretty amazing the way it's mapped out, in many ways. This opened up a whole field, if you will, of Spinoza studies too.
And then of course, because you mentioned
and others,
the plane of immanence also in difference and repetition, where he goes through precisely Duns Scotus, Spinoza, and Nietzsche at one point.
And Nietzsche is very much about pure immanence too. We'll go back to that. And this is why, again, I want us to be on guard sometimes reading a book like this. If you can suspend a little bit, it's very hard to do, but if you suspend a little bit of the Hegelian language and the notion of the mediacy and mediation, this is a book that is not about a theory of mediations. This is a very unmediated work. right? In many ways. They do not have a theory of mediations. In fact, they're both trying in different ways to avoid any kind of Hegelianism. They find Hegelianism to be a reestablishment of the coding of Judeo-Christian, end of history.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, no, I'm just saying. No, I mean, yeah. I mean, just maybe a different kind of confusion. Yeah, no, I know. I'm the same way. Believe me. Yeah. I mean, yeah. In many ways, look. This book was very. I mean, again, this text was very controversial. When it came out, and it really created a stir, and especially in France. We didn't get it in the States until 1977, I think was the first publication. It wasn't really read actively except in pockets. Josephus read it, Bruno's, read it, over the, but anyway, very limited audience in some ways. And Emile Plateau, most people say, oh, it's a good pedagogical tool. This is dangerous stuff. This is nothing but a minefield if you really think it through. This is a guerrilla warfare at work in thought, in my estimation. Maybe I'm overplaying it, but I really think it's a kind of guerrilla warfare that's going on in thought here. Yeah. It's leaving nothing unturned. Whether they do it effectively is another story. Yeah. Bruno, you wanted to say?
No. I remain.
Yeah. So
I agree. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, let me just go to quickly here, if you don't mind. I want to go to this section on Nietzsche just for a second. This is page 190 on the genealogy, and again, I think the Anti-Oedipus would take a much better dimension for you by looking at the second essay, particularly of the genealogy of morals. This is page 190 for me, but for you, it's probably easier to do. It's about 3 paragraphs before the beginning of section 6 of part 3. It's before the barbarian, before we go into the barbarian. So this is a kind of recapitulation, if you will, of the savage or of the untamed mind, and they're going to talk about that. So I begin with the great book of modern ethnology is not so much Mauss's The Gift, who was, again, Beryl knows this, Emil Durkheim's great nephew, who wrote The Gift, A General Theory of Magic, very well known in French circles, was a member of the French Collège de Sociologie. Just for people, I'm just throwing this out. I'm not trying to play. Okay, this is page 190 in the Minnesota version, Tony, but about 3 full paragraphs before the advent of section 6, right? It's still in section 5. All right. So at least it should be, they say, right? So it's kind of interesting, right? The great book, or at least it should be. All right. For the genealogy, the second essay is an attempt and a success without equal at interpreting primitive economy, or if you will, the savage or the untamed economy, in terms of death, filiation, alliance, and then the displaced representative Oedipus as a limit, in the debtor-creditor relationship by eliminating every consideration of exchange or interest a la Anglaise, right? The notion of self-interest, interest, as the English schools had it, are not to be operative in Nietzsche. And and by the way, the antagonist for Nietzsche in this, as a bit of an anecdote, is Paul Ray, who wrote a book called The Origin of Moral Sensations. Nietzsche is answering that book, the English School of Psychologists. Paul Ray, interestingly enough, was the husband of Lou Andrea Salome, who Nietzsche was, in love with, for a good part of his career, right? So anyway, and if they are eliminated from psychology, this notion of it is not in order to place them in structure. Nietzsche has only a meager set of tools at his disposal, some ancient Germanic law and a little Hindu law. But he does not hesitate, as does Mauss, between exchange and debt. George Bataille, motivated by Nietzschean inspiration, will not hesitate either. That goes without saying, right? And those of you interested in this, Bataille wrote a long meditation on Nietzsche, which is available in English, and on the Superman, or on, quote, the Overman, the Surhomme, right? The fundamental problem of this primitive socius, which is the problem of inscription, and here we go, the problem of inscription, of coding, and of marking has never been raised in such an incisive fashion. Man must constitute himself through the repression of the intense germinal influx, going back to Carl, where we started, right? The great biocosmic memory that threatens to deluge every attempt of collectivity. Excuse me. But at the same time, how is a new memory to be created? And this is always our problem. What is the new memory of the radical imagination? Right, in a sense. How do you create a new memory? This is very interesting, a way to look at things. How do you create a new memory, right, in the world, right? Yeah. Does the Bolshevik Revolution create a new memory? Yes, of course it does. It's a major rupture. It's a rift. May of '68, Badiou's, 4 events: the French Revolution, the Paris Commune, the Bolshevik Revolution, May of '68. Are these events, as as he calls them, are ways of creating a new memory? Yeah, possibly, right? To be created for man, a collective memory of the spoken word and alliances that declines the alliances with the extended filiations that endow him with the faculties of resonance and retention, of selection and detachment, and that affects in this way the coding of the flows of desire as a condition of the socius. How do we do this? How is a new memory to be created? And they give us a set of problems. And I think in terms of practice, this is one way of beginning to look at what schizoid analysis could be as a practice, both as symptom and as moving into the future. This is very interesting, this use of Nietzsche, in a way. The answer is simple. It is debt. Open, mobile, and finite blocks of debt. This extraordinary composite of the speaking voice, the marked body, and the enjoying eye. All the stupidity and the arbitrariness of the laws, all the pain of the initiations, the whole perverse apparatus of repression and education, Foucault right here, right? The red hot irons, and the atrocious procedures have only this meaning: to breed man. To breed man. Yeah, to dress man in the French. It's a nicer way to dress up man, but to breed, right? What is the breeding, right? And this is a section, by the way, in Will to Power on the breeding, right? In many ways, right? And yes, the book, The History of Debt by David Graeber is very important in this regard. To mark him in his flesh, to render him capable, and this is interesting too, to go to the socius, capable of alliance. To render him, it's based on debt. Yep. To form him within the debtor-creditor relation, which at both sides turns out to be a matter of memory. A matter of memory, a memory straining towards the future. I want to read this. I think this is very crucial, this end part. And, this is something to really think about moving forward. Far from bringing an appearance assumed by exchange, debt is the immediate effect or the direct means of the territorial and corporal inscription process. Debt is the direct result of inscription. Once again, no revenge, no ressentiment will be invoked here. This is not the ground they grow on, any more than does Oedipus. The fact that innocent men suffer all the marks on their body derives from the respective autonomy of the voice and the graphic action, and also from the autonomous eye that extracts pleasure from the event. And you can hear Guy Debord here, the Society of the Spectacle. You can hear all kinds of other resonations within this. Very, very interesting. It is not because everyone is suspected in advance of being a future bad debtor. And you can think, Carl, about the banking system here, and by the way, another great book by Jacques Le Goff on the dawn of modern banking. Do you know that book? It's very good in the Annals historian, the dawn of banking, right?
No, but
Okay, yeah, I'll mention it next week too. Okay, if the marks are not sufficiently taken in him, or if were or had he been unmarked, he has merely widened beyond the limits allowed, and this is interesting too, the gap that separated the voice of alliance and the body of filiation, to such a degree that it is necessary to reestablish the equilibrium through an increase in pain. Right? Nietzsche doesn't say this, but what does it matter? It's good. For it is indeed here that he encounters the terrible equation of debt. Injury done equals pain to be suffered. How does one explain, he asks, that the criminal's pain can serve as an equivalent of the harm he has done? How can one pay back with suffering? An I must be invoked that extracts pleasure from the event. This has nothing to do with vengeance, something that Nietzsche himself calls the evaluating I in many ways, right? And one can think of Bentham's panopticon here too, in some ways, as an apparatus, a material apparatus of the evaluating and all-seeing I, or the eye of the gods who enjoy cruel spectacles, right? And is in punishment. There's so much that is festive. This is Nietzsche speaking, and this is, basically the theater of cruelty, very in advance, if you will, of Antonin Artaud. So much is pain part of an active life and an obliging gaze. The equation injury equal pain has nothing exchangeous about it, and it shows in this extreme case that the debt itself has nothing to do with exchange. Simply stated, the I extracts from the pain. It is contemplating a surplus value of code that compensates the broken relationship between the voice of alliance that the criminal has wronged and the mark that had not sufficiently penetrated his body. The crime, a rupture of the phonographic connection, reestablished by the spectacle of the punishment, as primitive justice, territorial representation has foreseen everything. Coding pain and death.
No, Michael, if I may.
Yeah, please.
No. I have a question, because even when I read it before, and now again it comes back, but when they speak that way, the previous page about Marcel Mauss, right? And they say Nietzsche and then Bataille, they don't hesitate in making the equation between debt and exchange the way instead Mauss does. But they already speak about Marcel Mauss on page 150 in this edition, where they make a reference to the spirit of the thing, right? In Marcel Mauss, the obligation to reciprocate, right? Which in the gift, the word in Maori is how, H-A-U, right, the Maori word. So, but the question is, Nietzsche, of course, gives especially a description of a modern man, modern Europe, modern European, right? Whereas in, most deals, especially with the Maori, culture, and that's where the spirit of the thing is, which is something that in the forest. It's I don't know, maybe a one-sided understanding here of exchange, because after all, exchange can happen in many ways, and it is ultimately a necessity, a material necessity of life as well, right?
Again, for them, they're trying to, going back to the second paragraph I read, far from being an appearance assumed by exchange, debt is the immediate effect or the direct means of the territorial and corporal inscription process. Again, we're speaking about the body here, right? Yeah. Debt is the direct result of inscription, right? There's no such thing as the gift here, right? in a way, and reciprocity. No such thing. They're really trying to go further than Mauss. I understand, and I love Marcel Mauss.
Yeah.
And I like the notion of the gift because, again, the given in philosophy and in Husserl and in many philosophical systems, especially in phenomenology, that we see, the given is always there. What is the given, right? It's part of the gift. The
But
gift
also
really was
because
gift. Yeah, but
the
please.
gift in the Maori economy, the gift precisely has the function of making accumulation and surplus impossible, right? I mean, the potlatch, the Dena Bataille also speaks so much, right? That's basically right. I mean, you consume, and whatever you don't consume, you destroy, so that there is no accumulation. That's the logic in Maori culture, which is very beautiful. Oh yeah, I'm sorry.
We'll come back. No, it's okay.
Yeah.
I just want to finish this passage, and then we'll come back to the question of Mauss, the given, the gift, and exchange, and how it avoids, as you said, the potlatch avoids accumulation and this kind of exchangeist economy. Yeah, and it's interesting in that regard. But let me just go a little bit further to the end of this and see where they're going here, because this in kind of a way is a summary of filiation, alliance, and the Oedipal limit, if you will. Right? So coding pain and death, it has foreseen everything except for the way its own death would come to it from without. And this is another very interesting, they come like fate without reason, consideration, or pretext. They appear as lightning appears, too terrible, right? Too convincing, too sudden, too different even to be hated. Their work is an instinctive creation and imposition of forms. They are the most involuntary, unconscious artists there are. Wherever they appear, something new arises, a ruling structure that lives, in which parts and functions are delimited and coordinated, in which nothing whatever finds a place that has not first been assigned a meaning in relation to the whole. They do not know what guilt, responsibility, or consideration are, or for that matter, I would add, reciprocity, right? Or gifting, right? In a way, this is what Nietzsche's describing here, right? These born organizers, they exemplify their terrible artist's egoism that has the look of bronze and knows itself justified to all eternity in its work, like a mother in her child. It is not in them that the bad conscience developed, and again, this is a reading of the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals. That goes without saying, but it would not have developed if a tremendous quantity of freedom had not been expelled from the world, right? Or at least from the visible world, and made as it were latent under their hammer blows and artists' violence. It is here that Nietzsche speaks of a break, a rupture, a leap. So we have the break, the rupture, and the leap all in one, right? In a way. Who are these beings? They who come like fate. Some pack of blonde beasts of prey? A conqueror and master race which organized for war and with the ability to organize unhesitantly lays its terrible claws upon a populace perhaps tremendously superior in numbers, but still formless. Even the most ancient African myths speak to us of these blonde men. They are the founders of the state. Nietzsche will come to establish the existence of other breaks, those of the Greek city-state, Christianity, democratic and bourgeois humanism, industrial society, capitalism, and socialism. But it could be that all these, in various ways, presuppose the first great hiatus, although they all claim to repel and to fill it. It could be that spiritual or temporal, tyrannical or democratic, capitalist or socialist, there has never been but a single state, the state as dog that speaks with flaming roars. And Nietzsche suggests how this new socius proceeds. Again, a terror without precedence. Its comparison with which the ancient system of cruelty, the forms of primitive regimentation and punishment are nothing. a concerted destruction of all the primitive coatings, or worse yet, their derisory preservation, their reduction to the condition of secondary parts in the new machine and the new apparatus of repression. All that constituted the essential element of the primitive or the savage inscription machine, the blocks of mobile, open, finite deaths, the parcels of destiny, finds itself taken into an immense machinery that renders the debt infinite and no longer forms anything but one and the same crushing fate. The aim now is to preclude pessimistically once and for all the prospect of a final discharge. The aim now is to make the glance recoil disconsolatively from an iron impossibility. The earth becomes a madhouse. So this is a kind of summary of that. So yes, I think there's an argument with Mauss here that for them, the founders of the state, right, the Urstaat, if you will, and he'll go into this later, they'll go into the Urstaat later in terms of civilized and the way the state codes, etc., has nothing to do with given reciprocity or the gift. It is another form of an infinite debt system that is endless, right, in some ways, right, in this way. And it is really based on this creditor-debtor relationship rather than the relationship just between capital and labor in some ways. There's the normal way of looking at it, or the bosses and the worker. It's about the creditor-debtor relationship, but also about that inscription that is happening always, right? So I don't know, I'm kind of interested in how people think. This is a very provocative part of Nietzsche, the founding of the state, right? And the founders of the Urstaat, those artists of all, the legislator, the type, the legislator, right?
That's clearly seen in the Aztec sacrifice. So it's basically, in order for the world to keep moving, you needed to give energy, and the only energy was through blood. And so this really fits the that description, to inscribe in the bodies or death, basically the prolongation of life.
Right.
Or the,
Interesting. Yes.
Feed the sun, let's say, who needed energy in order to keep moving and going around the world.
Right.
So that was the formulation of the, I guess, the existence of the city-state in this case.
Yes, right. No, very, very good point, and something that Georges Bataille takes up, by the way, and very, very much so. Yeah. In terms of, Bataille was known that he really actually was serious about this. Broke off the relationship, by the way, with Walter Benjamin, that he actually believed in an actual human sacrifice, right? During his studies of the Aztecs and others, that he really wanted to do this. It's kind of interesting, this kind of violence. So again, this to me raises the question again of the violence of the coding, right? And what is happening here in this movement from filiation to alliance to the displaced Oedipus, and then this founding on the infinite debt to, for lack of a better term, the breaks, the ruptures, and the leaps in history. Right? How do these happen? And for them, again, the schizoid, in a way, or the schizzes are the new breaks, right? That we're seeing in this way. Breaks not in terms of the emergency break, but the breakage, the fracturing, the fissures that are happening at this point. So in a way, it is kind of Nietzschean in a sense that that's where the light is going to be in terms of understanding the cruel creativity towards the future, if you will. And I'm not, again, this is an argument. Nietzsche has no humanist, even though he breaks down as a human being in front of the horse in Turin, and has very difficult digestive problems, et cetera, in his personal life. There's not a trace of humanism in Nietzsche after the birth of tragedy. After the break with Wagner, not a touch of humanism, in my opinion. And this raises another question. This is certainly a document, if you will, the Anti-Oedipus, against any kind of humanist retrieval, right? So maybe one of the reasons that Mauss, in some ways, could be read as part of the humanist tradition, I don't know how you think about this, Bruno, but I see there's an opposition they're creating between Georges Bataille and Marcel Mauss here, and of course Nietzsche, in terms of, the genealogical method in terms of getting to this founding of the state, or this founding of, debt.
No, but in fact, that's interesting. I was just thinking that, and I don't want to romanticize, like past social formations, but certainly, if one thinks about society against the state, and they mention Pierre Clastre, or even Stone Age economics, right? By Marshall Salins, right? That
who just passed away, by the way.
Yeah. Surplus is not a necessity, an absolute necessity in social formations. Of course, there is a long tradition denying, society outside of the state, and this is Hobbes.
This is the book, great study, very good friend, by the way, of a Society Against the State. Pierre Clostre's own books is the best edition and translation. Very beautiful. Copernicus and the Savages is a great chapter to read alongside this book, by the way, the Anti-Oedipus. I recommend it highly in terms of psychoanalysis, ethnology, and of course what Bruno's talking about, the founding of the state and how certain societies exist against the state. Right.
Right. Because if you think of it, when Hobbes in that terrible blunder that we know the state of nature is a hypothesis, a fiction, but then he says in a parenthetical statement in Leviathan, although there are people living in that state by now, and he says they are the savages precisely, right, of the Americas, right? There is this tradition of in political thought, saying that the state is the only possible formation, but indeed that's not the case. So if you go beyond that, then you go beyond what they say. I agree. I like this very much. There has never been but a single state. Right. Yes. Right. But is there something which is not a state, and yet?
Well, I think Nietzsche, to be kind of faithful to to Nietzsche's thought, is Nietzsche's desire late. A genealogy is a later text, and certainly part of the quote unquote mature Nietzsche, or post break with Wagner and the earlier forms of and maybe a break with the Greeks, which is interesting too, which is one way of reading them. In a way, Nietzsche's desire, if you will, as a theorist and a thinker in the late 19th century, was to really elaborate a new Machiavellian politics. So in a way, Nietzsche could be, in terms of the genealogy, prefacing, what he begins to outline in The Will to Power. I read The Will to Power as an outline, in a way, towards a new political formation, right? What that looks like is beyond, is another story. But, I think this is why Nietzsche thinks this way, because he is moving in the direction of political thinking at the end here. Yeah. So, towards the end, he really wants to be the new Machiavelli of the 20th century, or the late 19th century, when he's still alive before his madness sets in. I think this is very important to keep in mind, with Nietzsche on this regard, right? I'm not so sure he's an anarchist, and some people read him. Certainly not a humanist, and certainly not a Democrat. or a social democrat or whatever, or what they've tried to do to him in the United States. There are many, many levels to this, as we all know. Walter Kaufman, depoliticizes and dehistoricizes, and we have a whole generation educated by Kaufman.
Certainly.
No,
certainly he's in opposition to the state. There is that wonderful chapter in Zarathustra, the new idol, I believe, right?
New idol.
Where he says the state is the coldest of all cold monsters, something like that, right? So he,
Yes.
It's a wonderful description of the state, and then of course is one sees in that the Nietzsche is completely against that. Yeah.
Right. But again, I think here what we're really trying to do, or what they're trying to do, and what we're trying to understand in all of our confusion, is this move that they begin the next section, the barbarian despotic machine. How do we move from the founding of the despotic machine or the barbarian socialist can be summarized in the following way. And what role does Nietzsche, why Nietzsche here, this rupture and leap? A new alliance and direct filiation. The despot challenges the lateral alliances and the extended filiations of the older community, of the old community. He imposes a new alliance system and places himself in direct filiation with the deity. The people must follow. A leap into a new alliance, a break with the ancient filiation. This is expressed in a strange machine, or rather, a machine of the strange whose locus is the desert. Very interesting, the desert, right? Imposing the harshest and the most barren of ordeals and attesting to the resistance of an old order as well as to the validation of the new order. The machine of the strange is both a great paranoid machine, since it expresses the struggle with the old system, and already a glorious celibate machine insofar as it exalts the triumph of the new alliance, right? In many ways. Right? The despot is the paranoiac. There is no longer any reason to forego such a statement. Once one has freed oneself from the characteristic familialism of the concept of paranoia in psychoanalysis and psychiatry, and provided one sees in paranoia a type of investment of a social formation. And new perverse groups spread the despot's invention. Perhaps they even fabricated for him, right? Broadcast his fame, impose his power in the towns they found or conquered. Wherever a despot and his army pass, doctors, priests, scribes, and officials are part of the procession. It might be said that the ancient complementarity has shifted to form a new socius, no longer the bush paranoiac and the encampment or the village perverts, but the desert paranoiac and the town paranoiacs in a way. So very interesting how we're looking here at everything from the Crusades to the feudal society and the birth of the sovereign, right? In this way. And this becomes a celibate desiring machine too in the new moment, right? And in some ways. So again, I think Nietzsche is trying to do this is interesting. He goes through Moses and the Egyptian machine, Christ, and I don't know if you guys had if you had a chance to read this whole thing, but it's pretty interesting the way this starts to develop. If you think about it again in terms of this unfolding from the savage, right, through the three, if you will, again, instances. Think about it as a movie, the instant of the affiliation, the instant of the alliance, the instant of the displaced representative displacement of Oedipus as a limit, right? Then how that Oedipus is a limit, and when you look at this founders of the new state, the Urstadt, these breaks, etc., how we get into the barbarian despotic machine, and then how this is going to fit in with terms of narratives, everything from Exodus to Abraham and new forms of territorial representation, so this is interesting, again, how they're working here. So this becomes about the next section is really about the early formation of the despotic state and its relationship to the Asiatic mode of production. And I really thank Josefa for bringing up the Aztec, because the Aztec is very important to Nietzsche in a way. Even though he's not an expert on this, he's very well aware of this. And of course, the law of Manu and the Hindu codes, the old codes in the law. He's very, very aware of this stuff, even though his tools are very limited. He's seen this, right? This cruelty, this mnemotechnics. And I think one thing we really have to retain, moving into the future, just as, quote, we try to overcome, and what does overcome really mean? Doesn't it mean creating new memory? Doesn't it mean creating something new in terms of forms and all of this? Yeah, David? Yes, yeah, you're muted. Yeah, I'm sorry.
Oh, no,
Oh, you were
moving
just saying, okay, you were just gesturing. Yeah.
I
Okay.
was just gesturing.
No problem. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. So I think it's interesting when we begin to see, for lack of a better term, the transitions, right, in these instances, right, from affiliation, alliance to the Oedipus as the limit, then the new limit being broached into the despot, right, and this moment. And there's a very interesting reading of the Asiatic mode of production. I don't know if you got to that, Carl. I know you know the Asiatic mode of production, but it's very interesting as it appears in the purest conditions of the Asiatic production, the despotic state. And they go through this very much. And look, you have to remember, they're reading the Cultural Revolution too at this time, right? This is another thing that's going on. You have to put yourself, again, what images, what representations are they filtering through this work too, in terms of what they're engaging? This is very, very important. And of course, daily reports from Vietnam and my favorite hero, General Giap, right? The Americans, we figured out, like to bomb after they have breakfast. He said that they like to bomb. You talk about anality, you like to bomb after you have breakfast. The generals in the U.S. Army, and the Viet Cong figure this out, right? And they know where to go to avoid, Yeah, it's amazing. General Giap, he's beautiful. I don't know if you've ever heard him speak, but it's absolutely musical French, right? Very disappointed in his son, became a travel agent. Anyway, but one of the greatest generals of the 20th century. Anyway, I've been thinking a lot about Ho Chi Minh and General Giap lately. Because of the bad union I'm in, I need guerrilla tactics. Yeah. Anyway, but anyway, I hope you see this. How these are formations again. They're looking again into formations, right? They're looking again into how these formations take place. So again, there's this critical, almost incessant, relentless, movement. It's really like communism in a sense, as Marx describes in the Grundrisse, the real movement, right? That incessantly, relentlessly criticizes, right? In a sense, this is part of the style here. It's very much in terms of what Marx would call real movement of thought, right? And real movement in the world together, right? Yeah. So this is very interesting in this respect, right? They go on to St. John, the Baptist enterprise. One author declares, John attacks that the foundation, the central doctrine of Judaism, the doctrine of the alliance with God through affiliation that goes back to Abraham. There's the essential. Every time the categories of new alliance and direct filiation are mobilized, we are talking about the imperial barbarian formation or the despotic machine. This holds true whenever the context of this mobilization, whether in a relationship, right, with preceding empires or not, since throughout these vicissitudes, the imperial formation is always defined by a certain type of code and inscription, right? That is in direct opposition to the primitive territorial codings, right? So we're going to see a difference here against the savage, right? And how this goes in culture in a way, I mean, I'll tell you a story, don't repeat this, but, so Cornel West was with Kathleen Battle, the opera singer, and she called him a barbarian. Right in the relay, and then he took it in stride. But anyway, it's kind of interesting how this still works in terms of descriptive terminology, these old filiations and alliances. This is many years ago. This is 30, 40, 35, 40 years ago. Yeah. But anyway, yeah. So how this language is used. But anyway, again, what we have to see here is how these formations are taking place. I think this notion of filiation, alliance, and then, of course, the Oedipus as a representative. You're not going to see Oedipus for a little while again in the text, right? We're going to go into decoding, decoding, and much more of the Marx is coming through here. The commune, Mycenaean relationships, all of this vis-a-vis the state, etc., right? And Carl, I don't know if you got to the point of where they go through, production machine later on, the full body, the theory of money, but they talk about this in the falling rate of profit, etc. So we're going to begin to get more into less of the psychoanalytic movement. So I can see David now asking you, Carl, can you explicate some of this political economy of the movement? Yeah, anyway,
yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean,
Yeah.
the chapter on the despotic state
Yeah.
is very interesting because, again, one of the things I sort of see them doing is it's almost a genealogy of Oedipus, because Oedipus then, there is sort of this figure of this constant dialogue with the Oedipal configuration and how that then emerges prior to we almost have it, but then what I anticipate is that they will move into the discussion of capitalism, and
Right.
at that point the conditions of this coding have been
Right.
fully achieved, and very interesting. So
Yeah, I mean, another thing, I'll play on something else here, which is more out of the Christian tradition, but a radical Christian tradition. Dostoevsky poses the paradox. If we kill God, we kill ourselves. He does through the character of Kirillov. If we kill Oedipus, do we kill the structure in which we all inhabit? What do we really do? I mean, this is another kind of paradox that we have to live with, right, in a sense, and what's going on here. I mean, again, yeah. I mean, as they say, the death of God, it's like, so what when it finally hits Nietzsche's given us 15 versions of the death of God. We have many stories. We have a network TV series, right? 15 episodes, on the latest, from the joyful wisdom to Marx's opiate of the people to Freud's, infantile projection, et cetera, futures of an illusion. We could do a TV series, futures of an illusion, or futures for an illusion, or something like that. But anyway, all to say, still the paradox remains, because what are we really actually destroying? What are we actually undergoing in terms of, is it a positive destruction in the German sense? I mean, one of the people I met today, well, actually I'd met him before, a philosopher in Montreal, is working on a book on the history of destruction as a philosophical term in German philosophy, from Husserl to Heidegger, through Heidegger. And he's looking at a period of 1922 till about 1931 or something like that. So we had a little discussion about that. I pointed out to him, the first person to use deconstruction was Marx, Abbau, in German. He used this to unbuild. That's the term of which deconstruction comes from, right? You undo, you unbuild something, Abbau. And then there's the phenomenological destruction, right? But Marx is the proto-deconstructionist, right? So, I get a little upset when I see specters of Marx, on the shelf, that all of a sudden, we decide late in life to encounter Marx. Anyway, Derrida's very cagey, to put it mildly, and is going back, in a sense. Yeah. But yeah, so I mean, yeah, there's a lot to do here again. Yeah, I mean, any other people want to say anything, or any critiques, or what else we might do? I mean, I would like to try to get through most of the rest of this part 3. As far as we can go, maybe up to, and again, we take our times to maybe section 10, and yes, it ends with Oedipus at last, not Oedipus at the limit, but this section, part 3, ends with Oedipus at last, at the end. So this is an interesting thing. So why don't I'll use the website, maybe for some, again, hopefully we'll have some time beyond the teaching responsibilities and all kinds of other stuff going on, to maybe put something up on the website, but I'll put up the readings. But I'd like us, if you have the chance, to read through all of part 3 for next time. Yeah, for April the 21st, through Oedipus at last. And so we would begin really in a way with this section on the barbarian, right? I think we have a somewhat, you can tell me if it's not enough, grasp of the early, the untamed, or the sauvage, right, in French, and that moment in history, and now how we're switching to the despotic, the despot and the despot machine, and ultimately to the, well, of course, to the barbarian, right? And that formation in history. I don't know if any of you know Lynn White. Do you know Lynn White? He was a teacher of Marshall Salem's, by the way. He wrote a book on technology in the Middle Ages. Deleuze likes this book very much. I think Lynn White's work on technology and the war machine is operative in this reading. It's a kind of hidden text that they're using that they don't cite. I don't think Lynn White is cited in this book. Let me check the index, but I don't remember Lynn White being.
What's the name again? You said Lynn White.
Lynn, Lynn White.
Okay.
White. Yeah. Technology in the Middle Ages. Right. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. The website, Leslie, I'll put it out there. Matt has it, I guess. It's on the Left Forum, Anti-Oedipus. It's on the Left Forum site, right? If I'm not mistaken, Matt, if you're still here.
The YouTube videos, or
no, the reading list, the syllabus. Yeah, and then
okay.
Yeah. Is that on the website, or is it? Yeah, he'll put it up for you, Leslie. Yeah. Anyway, I'm figuring we have at least 4 more sessions to get through this, maybe more. So I don't mind going beyond. This will be good to get to the introduction to schizoid analysis. What does it really do? And then maybe we can end. I put on the reading that you could read double articulation in Mille Plateau if you have a copy of it. It may help you. It's the 2nd chapter of Mille Plateau. Yeah. It's called double articulation. It's a lobster. It's double articulating. It's kind of an interesting image that they use. These people are out there, but it's good. I mean, to me, it's very interesting and very intelligent and creative. Going forward, it's a very serious work. I was told first of all when I started, it's a fun book. And then I said, fun? Yeah, I mean, wait a minute. This is the real deal here. Yeah, I'm sorry. What? Yeah, I was told that by a Heideggerian. Yeah. Anyway, so it's not so much fun. Yeah, but anyway, it's got a lot in it to work with. And they do have humor. They are kind of fun. Yeah, there is a lot of humor here. And I'm all for cheerful Nietzschean nihilism if it can produce us, into something different than the sad, depressed leftism that we're so accustomed to, and the whole culture. I'm a victim. I'm this way. This happened, et cetera, et cetera. How many times do we have to hear the same old story, right? In many ways. Yeah.
I would be curious if, how would this differ from like Marcuse's use of Nietzsche or in the Dialectic of Enlightenment?
I think you have a very good point in terms of the latter text. I'm not so sure in terms of Marcuse. For Marcuse, Nietzsche is an interlude, between Freud and Marx, in some ways. And I don't really think Marcuse takes Nietzsche as seriously. To Adorno, especially, Nietzsche is a crucial philosopher for modernity. It's certainly for Marcuse too, but the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the essay on Juliet, right, or morality of enlightenment, is really amazing, right? In a sense, I think it's one of the great essays for our time. Should be really reread and rethought, etc. And if anybody wants to discuss it, I consider it to be one of the most crucial essays out there. Much more advanced in some ways than the Bataille and other stuff that that Pasolini cites in Salo. But please, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah, I was thinking of the Oedipus, not Oedipal, but Odysseus.
Oh,
discussion.
So the myth of enlightenment. No, Nietzsche plays out more is in the 2nd chapter.
Oh, I know. Yeah, but I'm thinking. I'm just thinking in terms of this analysis of this transition from what is it, barbarism to the state.
Oh yeah, I see what you're saying. You know, that's interesting. Yes, yeah, the myth of
Yeah.
enlightenment. Yeah, that's a very good,
Mhm.
good point to bring up. Yeah. I thought your question was more oriented directly about Nietzsche and the role to the Frankfurt School and to Marcuse. Yeah. But it's a great dialectic of the Enlightenment should be studied and restudied. And
Oh yes.
it's really one of the most dense. You know, written in 44, published in 47, right? And just a wonderful collaboration. Even Foucault, if I had read Adorno's theories of micrologies earlier, I wouldn't have made so many mistakes as I did. Foucault said that about the Frankfurt School. You know, the French have their way of giving the Germans credit long after it's over, right? They remember the occupation and the conflicts very well. But in a sense, yeah, in a way, yeah, you know, yeah. Maybe French philosophy is the translation of German metaphysics into French esprit, right? In some ways, this is what the French do so well: take German metaphysics and make it playful in a different way. So, but anyway, it's a great association. Again, that's the first essay for people that don't know: Odysseus or the Myth of Enlightenment in the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Yeah. In a way, in terms of these transitions, etc. So yeah, it's good to read that kind of parallelism. And this is, you know, essentially in some ways how Deleuze and Guattari worked, right? They said, well, have you read my friend Adler, the anthropologist? And Deleuze says, no, but tell me about him. Let's put him in the book, you know, etc. So this is, you know, what real intellectual life should be about in some ways. Yeah. So anyway, so any other, thank you, Bruno. Yeah, any other comments? I mean, we can close. I don't want to keep you past, I know Beryl's at about, what, noon for you? And for us in New York, we're, almost on Greek time for dinner. I know Italian time just left. The Greeks are a little later sometimes than the Italians. The Spanish are the best. You know, don't eat dinner till 11. But anyway, yeah. So okay, well, thank you, everybody, and well, look forward to next week, and I hope some of it's starting to gel a little bit. Maybe we can see it on.